Please like, share, and subscribe. Wishing you happiness and good luck every day.
Have you ever wondered how empires that seem totally invincible can just crumble? Well, it often comes down to one of the most powerful but least understood forces in all of history, the long-term debt cycle. So let's dive in and break it down. Our guide on this journey is investor Ray Dalio. Now, he has spent more than 50 years studying these massive cycles, and what he's done is develop a really practical framework, not just for understanding history, but for making sense of what's happening in the markets right now.
And it all really starts with this one huge question, a question that honestly affects every single one of us. Can a major world power, even one with the global reserve currency, actually go broke? And if it did, what would that even look like?
To get to the answer, Dalio says we have to look past the daily news headlines, past all the noise. He points to a much bigger, almost hidden pattern, a debt cycle, that has repeated itself over and over again for thousands of years, literally shaping the rise and fall of nations.
So, what is this cycle? Well, we're all pretty familiar with the short-term business cycle, right? The ups and downs we feel every few years. But there's a much, much bigger one operating in the background, one that's a lot harder to see.
And here's where it gets kind of mind-bending. The time scale. A short-term business cycle that lasts maybe 6 years. We live through several of those in our lifetimes. But the big debt cycle, that thing plays out over about 80 years. Think about that. That means most of us only ever experience one of these, if we're lucky. And that makes it incredibly difficult to spot and dangerously easy to ignore. So how does this giant hidden cycle actually take shape? Well, it's built, believe it or not, piece by piece, from all those smaller cycles that we're already familiar with. The engine that drives this whole thing is credit. Dalio has a great way of describing it. He says it's like a stimulant. It feels fantastic because it lets us spend more than we actually earn, and that creates this temporary economic high. But every stimulant creates debt, right? And that debt is the obligation to pay it all back later, which acts like the depressant on future growth.
You can see exactly how it works here. Each one of those short-term cycles of borrowing and paying back, it ends with just a little bit more debt than the last one. Over decades, these smaller cycles just stack up and up and up, pushing the total amount of debt higher and higher until the whole system just reaches a breaking point.
Now, here's what's so fascinating. According to Dalio's research, this process isn't random at all. It actually follows a pretty predictable 5-stage pattern that has repeated itself across different empires and different currencies for centuries. So, let's walk through these 5 stages. It all kicks off with a healthy period of what's called sound money, where debt is pretty manageable. But then, that inflates into a debt bubble. It hits the top and then collapses into a really painful period of deleveraging. And finally, the whole thing resets with a return to hard money, basically a new, more reliable system.
So in the beginning, things are good. Debt is low, it's being used for productive things. But success breeds this powerful psychological force, collective optimism. Everybody gets confident, and that confidence leads to overborrowing, to speculation, and that's what inflates a massive debt bubble. Everyone feels rich, and they start to think the good times are never going to end.
But a party like that can't last forever. Eventually, the debt just becomes totally unsustainable. The bubble pops, and the system is forced into a deleveraging. And that is a painful, often chaotic period of trying to get all that debt back in line with what people are actually earning. Now, this deleveraging phase, this is the most dramatic and dangerous part of the entire cycle. And it forces policymakers, especially central banks, into what is basically an impossible choice. At its core, a debt crisis is actually pretty simple. The system has just made way more promises to pay people than there is actual money available to fulfill those promises. It's a giant IOU that can't be paid. This leaves the central bank stuck between a rock and a hard place with 2 terrible options. Option 1, they can just step back and let everyone default on their debts, which would trigger a brutal, deflationary depression. Or option 2, they can create new money out of thin air to bail everybody out, but that devalues the currency and completely wipes out people's savings. Neither one is good. So what do they do? Which path do they take? Well, Dalio's study of history is absolutely clear on this. When faced with this choice, central banks always, and I mean always, eventually choose to print the money. Why? Because it's the politically easier path, despite the painful consequences it has for the currency and for anyone who is trying to save.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway from all this? Why does this historical pattern matter to us, right here, right now?
It matters because this debt cycle doesn't happen in a vacuum. Dalio sees it as just one of 5 major forces that shape history. You've got the debt cycle, internal political conflict, external geopolitical conflict, acts of nature, and new technologies. When these big forces start to align, that's when you can get these profound world-changing shifts in power and in wealth.
Now look, the point of this whole framework isn't to get out a crystal ball and predict the exact future. Nobody can do that. The goal is to give us a kind of timeless and universal template. Think of it like a map that helps us understand where we are, how we got here, and what the range of possibilities might be for what's coming next.
It's a really powerful tool for thinking. So the final question is for you. As you look at the world through this new lens, using this template, what signs of this big debt cycle do you see happening right now?
You ever wonder why these huge economic booms and busts seem to come out of nowhere? These massive events that feel completely random and chaotic? Well, what if I told you they aren't random at all? What if they're actually following a predictable script, one that's been playing out over and over again for centuries? Right, so let's really get into this. We're going to explore a really powerful idea called the big debt cycle. It's a way of looking at the world that helps us understand these huge, long-term forces that build up fortunes and then, well, tear them down. And to really get it, we have to start with the engine that makes the whole thing go. And that engine, the heart of this whole machine, is credit. It's so common, right? Our credit cards, our mortgages, we use it all the time. But we hardly ever stop and think about what it actually is. It's this simple act of borrowing from our future selves that kicks off these massive economic cycles. Okay, so credit isn't some kind of magic money tree. Think of it more like a time machine for your spending. It lets you pull your future income into today so you can spend more right now. And that feels great. But, and this is the crucial part, it comes with a non-negotiable promise. Sooner or later, you have to spend less than you earn to pay that money back. That push and pull is what creates the cycle. And here's where it gets really powerful. See, when you borrow money and spend it, that spending becomes somebody else's income. And now that person feels richer, so maybe they go out and borrow and spend. And that becomes income for yet another person. It's this feedback loop that just supercharges the economy on the way up. But of course, it works in reverse too. When it's time to pay the debt back, you spend less. That means less income for someone else, and the whole thing slows down. This simple little machine is behind it all. Now, most of us are pretty familiar with the small waves, the normal ups and downs the economy goes through. But the real danger, the thing that catches everyone by surprise, is the giant tsunami that's been building up for decades underneath the surface. The short-term cycle, that's what we usually call the business cycle. It's the rhythm we hear about on the news all the time. The economy grows, maybe gets a little too hot, so the central bank raises interest rates to cool things off. That leads to a recession. Then, to get things moving again, they lower interest rates. Lather, rinse, repeat. It's a pretty familiar pattern that usually lasts about 6 to 9 years. But here is the absolute key. At the end of each of those little cycles, the people in charge never let the system fully reset. They're always eager to get growth going again, so they cut rates and encourage more borrowing before all the old debt has really been paid down. So a little bit of debt gets left behind each time. And over decades, 50, 75, even 100 years, those little waves of leftover debts stack on top of each other until, bam, you've got one enormous tsunami of debt. So here's how you can tell the difference. At the end of a short-term cycle, a recession, the fix is pretty simple. The central bank just lowers interest rates, and that makes borrowing cheap and attractive again. Problem solved. But at the end of a big debt cycle, the debt levels are just astronomical. They're so high that you can cut interest rates all the way to zero, and it doesn't do a thing. The system is just completely saturated with debt that can't be paid back. The old tools are useless. So how does one of these massive cycles actually play out? Well, it's not a mystery. It follows a really predictable path with 4 distinct stages. You can almost think of them as the 4 seasons of an economy. Just like recognizing the seasons, we can see where we are by looking for the signs. It starts out healthy, then builds into this crazy speculative bubble, which, of course, always pops. And then comes the final, painful cleanup phase they call the deleveraging. Let's start at the beginning. So, in the beginning, right after the last big crash is over, people are still feeling the sting. They remember the pain, so they're cautious. Debt is low, and when people do borrow, it's for productive stuff, things that will actually generate enough income to pay back the loan. It's a healthy, stable system. But you know how it goes. Success makes people forget. In the bubble stage, the lessons of the past fade away. Credit gets super easy and cheap, and people start borrowing like crazy, not just for productive things, but to speculate, to bet on stocks or real estate, pushing prices up into the stratosphere. At this point, debt is growing way, way faster than incomes. It's a dangerous game, but it creates this incredible illusion of wealth. And then the music stops. The trigger could be anything, really. Maybe the central bank raises rates just a little too much, or maybe the debt load just collapses under its own weight. But whatever the cause, the bubble pops. And once it starts, the collapse feeds on itself. Asset prices fall, which makes the debt tied to them go bad, which leads to more selling, pushing prices down even more. The panic spreads like wildfire. And that brings us to the final and most agonizing stage, the deleveraging. This is the cleanup. The system has to get rid of all that bad debt, one way or another. That massive gap between how much is owed and how much can be paid has to be closed, and it usually happens through a brutal mix of bankruptcies, debt restructuring, and, the most important tool of all, creating brand new money out of thin air. It's during this final deleveraging phase that the people in charge, especially the central bankers, find themselves completely backed into a corner. They face this moment of truth, a truly impossible choice that's going to shape the economy for a generation. This quote just nails it. The whole financial system is basically a web of promises to deliver money in the future. But at the peak of the cycle, the sheer number of those promises, all that debt, is way bigger than the amount of actual money and income available to keep them. The math simply doesn't work anymore. So what can they do? Well, they've got two basic options, and frankly, they both stink. Option A, let it all burn down. Let companies, banks, even people go bankrupt. This is the path to a deflationary depression. It's economically catastrophic, and politically, it's suicide. Then there's option B, fire up the money printers. The central bank just creates trillions of dollars to bail everyone out, papering over all the bad debt. This avoids the depression, sure, but it crushes the value of the currency, punishing anyone who is responsible and saved their money. So when they're faced with that choice, a painful depression versus devaluing the currency, what does history show us they do? Every single time, they print the money. They always print. Why? Because the social chaos and political fallout from a full-blown depression is just too terrifying to even consider. Firing up the money printer is, politically, the path of least resistance. Okay, so why do we care about all this? Because this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. Understanding this cycle gives you a map. It helps you see that what often feels like total, unprecedented chaos is really just a pattern repeating itself. It helps you make sense of the world we're living in right now. So let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways? 1, these huge crises are basically inevitable. It's just human nature to get too optimistic and take on too much debt. 2, they aren't random. They follow a clear, recognizable pattern. 3, if a country owes debt in its own currency, the central bank is absolutely going to print money to deal with the crisis. And finally, these moments create massive risks for most people, but for the few who actually understand what's happening, they can be once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. I think this quote says it all, really. We get so comfortable with the way things are, we just assume it's permanent. A huge change to our economic or monetary system seems completely unthinkable, right up until the moment it happens. By understanding this cycle, you can see the warning signs, which brings us to the final and most important question of all. Looking at this predictable script and looking at the world around you, where do you think we are in the cycle right now?
You know, the economy can feel like this massive, unpredictable force, right? But what if it's not random at all? What if it's actually more like a machine with simple, understandable parts? Well, today, we're going to pop the hood and take a look inside.
I mean, this is the big question that affects every single one of us. Why do we have these huge swings, these incredible periods of growth, followed by these really painful recessions? It feels totally chaotic, but the answer, it actually lies in the machine's design.
And that's the key. You have to see the economy as a machine that just operates in cycles. Once you understand its core components and you see how they all interact, you can start to see these hidden patterns behind all the crazy headlines.
Okay, so to get started, we have to go right to the most fundamental part of the entire machine, the transaction. But we're going to look at it in a way that might be a little bit different from what you learned back in Econ 101.
Think about it. Every single thing that happens in the economy boils down to this one simple exchange. A buyer offers up some money or credit, and a seller provides something in return. This is the atom, the basic building block of literally everything else.
And here is the crucial idea. The price of anything, a cup of coffee, a car, a stock, is simply the total amount of money and credit spent on it divided by the total quantity of it that was sold. Price equals total spending over quantity. It's really that straightforward. So here's where the perspective really shifts. The conventional view, the one we all learn, focuses on the quantity of things being bought and sold. But this model says, hang on, what really moves prices is the total flow of spending. This simple change helps explain why prices sometimes do things that seem to defy traditional supply and demand.
So who's actually operating this machine? Well, it turns out there are 5 major groups, and their motivations and their actions are what drive all of these transactions and ultimately the economic cycles themselves.
First up, you've got your borrowers and your lenders. Then you have the banks, who kind of connect them. You've also got the central government, which spends and taxes, and finally, the central bank, which controls the money. Honestly, understanding what each of them wants is the key to everything. Let's start with this fundamental tension, right? Borrowers, who become debtors, obviously want low interest rates. Makes sense. But the lenders, the creditors, they want high interest rates to make a good profit. These two opposing goals create a constant push and pull in the system. And then you've got another built-in conflict. The central government is political. Its main goal is to spend money to keep voters happy. And that often means borrowing. The central bank, on the other hand, its job is to keep the whole system from either overheating or completely collapsing. So they're kind of like the brakes, while the government often wants to just slam on the gas. So what happens when you put all these players with their conflicting goals together? You might think you'd get chaos, but instead you get a surprisingly predictable rhythm, a series of cycles kind of nested inside of one another. This visual here shows the two main rhythms perfectly. We have these smaller, short-term debt cycles. Those are the booms and busts we all know and feel. But look at how they all take place along the curve of a much, much larger cycle, the big debt cycle. And that long straight line underneath it all? That's us. That's human productivity, just pushing everything steadily upward over time.
Now, the short-term cycle, that's the familiar business cycle. It usually lasts about 6 years, give or take. The central bank lowers interest rates to get things going, the economy gets a little too hot, so they raise rates to cool it all down, which leads to a recession, and then the cycle just starts all over again.
But here's the really crucial part. Each of those little short-term cycles typically ends with a little more debt in the system than the one before it. And over many, many decades, this debt just keeps piling up, creating this massive generational big debt cycle that lasts about 80 years.
And that, of course, leads to the inevitable question. This buildup can't just go on forever. So what happens at the end of the big debt cycle, when the sheer weight of all that debt becomes completely and totally unsustainable? This is it. This is the most turbulent, the most dangerous part of the entire process. It's the moment when the machine's normal balancing acts just stop working, and the system is forced into a major, painful reset.
So the core problem is this. The central bank gets trapped. They're stuck. If they raise interest rates high enough to satisfy lenders who are, worried about their money, those same rates will bankrupt all the borrowers and just crash the economy. But if they keep rates low, the lenders will just take their money and run. The entire system just seizes up. At this point, policymakers are left with only 4 levers they can possibly pull. They can force everyone to spend less, that's austerity. They can just let businesses and people fail on their debts. They can print a whole lot of new money. Or they can redistribute wealth through things like taxes. And believe me, none of these options are easy or popular.
The most common first response is almost always austerity, just tighten the belts. But this is usually a trap. Why? Well, because one person's spending is another person's income. So when everyone cuts back at the same time, incomes plummet across the board, and the overall debt problem can actually get even worse. So, is there a way out of this trap? The answer is yes. But managing this kind of crisis isn't a science, it's an art. It requires engineering something called a beautiful deleveraging.
So what this means is skillfully balancing two totally opposing forces. On one side, you have things like debt restructuring, which is deflationary. It destroys wealth. And on the other side, you have printing money, which is, of course, inflationary. If policymakers can get that balance just right, these two forces basically cancel each other out, and it allows the debt burden to fall without totally crushing the real economy.
So after looking under the hood of this whole economic machine, what are the key things to remember? Think of this as your quick guide, your own operator's manual for how the system really works.
All right, here's what you need to take away. The economy's ups and downs, they're not mystical, they're mechanical.
It all operates on two main cycles, the short-term one we see all the time, and that huge one that defines entire generations. And while these big debt crises are pretty much inevitable, they can be managed with a beautiful deleveraging. And through it all, what ultimately drives us forward is our own productivity and innovation.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty crucial question. If these big 80-year cycles are an inevitable feature of the economic machine, it probably pays to ask, based on everything we've just looked at, where do you think we are in the cycle today?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a huge question. How does an entire country go broke? What are the actual warning signs? We're going to break down the mechanics, kind of like a doctor giving a patient a full physical.
And this analogy right here really hits the nail on the head for our whole conversation. Just imagine a country's economy as this big, complex circulatory system, right? Money's flowing in, money's flowing out. But when debt starts building up, it's like plaque clogging those arteries, slowing everything down. And if it gets bad enough, well, you get a catastrophic event.
So, that's the big question, isn't it? You know how a doctor looks for things like high blood pressure or a weird EKG? Well, how do economists do the same thing for a country? What are the vital signs they check to see if a nation is heading for serious financial trouble?
To get a real diagnosis, it turns out economists and policymakers zero in on 4 key indicators. You can think of it as a routine checkup for a country's finances, designed to catch problems before they become a full-blown emergency.
And here they are, the 4 vital signs we're going to look at. First, how much debt does a country have compared to its income? Second, how much of that income is just getting eaten up by debt payments? Third, is the economy actually growing faster than the interest on its debt? And finally, what's in the emergency fund? What kind of savings does it have as a buffer? Let's break these down one by one.
Okay, let's tackle this first one. This is the 30,000-foot view. We're just asking, how much does the country owe versus how much does it earn, mostly from taxes? This is the exact metric that was flashing bright red for Greece before its big debt crisis back in 2010. Their total debt just soared way past their national income, and that was a huge signal the whole thing was becoming unsustainable.
And for those of you who want to peek under the hood, this is the formula that's actually driving the calculation. You can see how it balances what a government spends against what it earns. Then it factors in the interest on its debt, and it has to consider how fast its revenue is growing. All these pieces have to fit together just right.
All right, on to vital sign number 2. Now this one measures the immediate pressure. It's not about the total mountain of debt, but about the size of the yearly bill just to service that debt. I mean, when a country like Lebanon saw its debt service payments eat up over half of its government revenue, well, that leaves almost nothing for hospitals, roads, schools. You can see just how painful that pressure can be.
And here, again, you can see the math behind it. Your future debt service payments are basically a function of interest costs and principal payments, all stacked up against how fast the country's revenue is growing. And if that revenue isn't growing fast enough, this ratio can get ugly fast.
Let's look at vital sign number 3. And honestly, this one is absolutely crucial. It asks a really simple question. Is the country's economy growing faster than its debt is piling up? Because think about it. If the interest rate on its debt is higher than its income growth rate, that debt burden is going to get worse all by itself, even if the government doesn't borrow a single extra dollar.
And this formula just illustrates that point perfectly. To keep the debt stable, the interest rate has to be balanced out by revenue growth. Here's the key takeaway. If interest rates climb higher than income growth, that debt burden is just going to increase on autopilot. This is probably the single most important variable in this whole thing.
And finally, our 4th vital sign, the emergency fund. This one looks at a country's debt compared to its savings or its financial reserves. Because even if those other indicators look pretty bad, a country with a huge pile of savings can weather the storm for a while. It can use that buffer to make its payments and buy itself some time.
So these formulas here apply the same logic we've been talking about, but this time they're measuring debt against savings instead of income. Now, having a big savings buffer can buy a country some really valuable time, but it is not a permanent solution. That buffer will eventually run out.
So, what happens when all 4 of these vital signs are flashing red? This is when a country can get trapped in a really dangerous feedback loop. It's what economists call a debt-death spiral. It is a classic downward spiral, and we've seen this play out in places like Argentina. It starts when rising debt makes lenders nervous, so they start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for the risk.
But of course, those higher rates make the debt payments even more expensive, which just makes the debt problem worse, which scares lenders even more, and you can see how this quickly becomes a self-reinforcing crisis.
So once a country is caught in this spiral, how does it get out? Well, the treatment options are limited, and to be honest, they're all pretty painful. There are basically 4 ways a government can try to get its debt burden under control.
They can slash government spending, which we call austerity. They can just default on their debts. They can have their central bank print a bunch of money to buy up the debt. Or they can try to transfer wealth through much higher taxes. None of these are easy, and every single one has some really serious economic and political side effects.
Now, of those 4 really tough options, governments pretty often turn to one in particular, having their central bank print money to buy up government debt. On the surface, it can look like the easiest way out, the path of least resistance.
Okay, so let's get into how this actually works. The central bank essentially creates new money out of thin air and then uses it to buy government bonds. This pumps cash into the system, and it keeps the government's borrowing costs from spiraling completely out of control. But, and this is a big but, it comes with a major side effect. And that major side effect is devaluing the currency. The more money a central bank prints to absorb government debt, the less that currency can be worth on the world stage. As you can see from this chart, a small-scale intervention might lead to a 10% drop in currency value. But a massive intervention, that could cause the currency to fall by a staggering 58%.
So now that we understand the vital signs, the disease, and the treatments, let's look at the final prognosis. To really understand the scale of the challenge here, let's bring it home and look at the numbers for a country like the U.S.
This table shows what it would take to stabilize the U.S. debt-to-income ratio over the next decade. But here's the catch. You can only pull one of these levers. So you'd either need to slash interest rates all the way down to just 1%, or you need to let inflation run hot at 4.5%, more than double the projection. Or you could try a 12% cut in government spending or an 11% hike in tax revenue. Each one of these on its own is a monumental political and economic task.
So the bottom line is, there are no easy answers. There's no magic bullet. Each path has these profound consequences. And that brings us to our final thought for you. Looking at these really stark choices, if you were the one in charge, what combination of these bitter pills would you prescribe to try and restore the country's financial health? It's a massive puzzle with incredibly high stakes.
When you hear about an entire country going broke, it just sounds like total chaos, right? Some kind of random, unpredictable disaster. But what if I told you it's not random at all? That it actually follows a pretty clear script, a pattern that's been repeating for over 100 years. Today, we're going to break down that exact script. So how does it really happen? It's definitely not a lightning strike out of a clear blue sky. It's more like a slow-motion train wreck. And believe it or not, it's a process we can actually map out. By looking at dozens of major debt crises, a clear, almost archetypal sequence of events emerges. So let's dive in and unpack this process, step by step. This predictable pattern has a name. It's called the big debt cycle. You can think of it like a blueprint for financial collapse. It shows us exactly how these crises build up steam, hit their peak, and then eventually get resolved. And if you understand this cycle, you can start to see the warning signs all around us. Okay, but before we jump into the actual stages of the crisis, we have to get one crucial thing straight. The 2 fundamental types of money a country can have, because, as you'll see, the system a country uses completely changes how a crisis plays out. So on one side, you've got hard money. Think of the old gold standard, where every dollar was basically a claim check for a real physical asset. In a system like that, a crisis is like flipping a switch. The government breaks its promise and bam, the value collapses almost overnight. On the other side, you have fiat money, which is what pretty much all of us use today. Its value is based purely on, well, faith, trust in the government and its central bank. In a fiat system, the collapse isn't a sudden snap, it's more of a slow, grinding devaluation over time.
And this is key because ever since the U.S. left the gold standard back in 1971, almost the entire world has been on a fiat system. So for the rest of this breakdown, we're going to be focused on that gradual devaluation model, because it's by far the most relevant for understanding how a modern country goes broke.
All right, so how does this whole thing actually start? It all begins with the first phase of the crisis, the debt squeeze. The best way to think about it is like the unhealthy conditions that build up for years before someone has a heart attack. On the surface, the system might look totally fine, but underneath, the pressure is just mounting. Here's how it tends to go down. First, everybody, we're talking companies, households, the government itself, starts taking on way too much debt. Then, inevitably, the private sector hits a wall, forcing the government to step in with a bailout. This means the government absorbs all that private debt onto its own books. And this is what leads to the squeeze. The government now has a mountain of its own debt to sell, but investors are getting really nervous, and there just aren't enough buyers anymore. And right there, that is your first big flashing red flag. When you see investors, both foreign and domestic, start dumping a country's government bonds in huge volumes, it's a massive signal. It means they've lost faith in the government's ability to pay its bills. The crisis is no longer a what if, it's here.
Now, this is where the story gets really dramatic. To try and stop the bleeding, the country's central bank has to step in. The problem is, its attempts to fix things often end up creating this dangerous self-reinforcing spiral, where every move just makes the situation worse.
So check this out. The bond sell-off pushes interest rates up and crushes the currency. The central bank tries to help by making credit easier, but that just weakens the currency even more. Pretty soon, with interest rates near zero, their only option is to essentially print money to buy all the government debt nobody else wants. But here's the trap. As market interest rates keep rising, the bank starts losing money on the very bonds it's buying. It's now paying out more in interest than it's earning from them. It's a vicious cycle. And this really highlights the point of no return. As the source material says, when the central bank itself has a significant negative net worth, that's the second giant red flag. It signals that the bank is caught in a death spiral. It has to print more money just to cover its own losses, which devalues the currency even more, which causes more investors to sell. You see the loop. The central bank has, for all intents and purposes, gone broke. So is that it? Is it game over? Well, not quite. After the spiral comes the reset. And let's be clear, it's an incredibly painful and difficult process. But there is a well-worn path that countries take to try and find their way back to some kind of stability. The ideal path out of this mess is what the source calls a beautiful deleveraging. It's basically the process of reducing debt. It's not about one single solution, but about this very careful balancing act, balancing inflationary things like printing money with deflationary things like restructuring debt. The whole goal is to lower the debt burden without either crushing the economy or letting inflation run completely wild. Getting there requires some really tough medicine. We're talking debt restructuring, devaluing the currency, and often new, extraordinary taxes. Governments will usually impose capital controls, which are basically just rules to stop money from physically leaving the country. And, critically, they have to impose very tight monetary policy with high real interest rates to restore faith in the currency. They have to reward savers for a change. Ultimately, that entire painful process has one simple goal: to get back to reality. It's all about forcing debt levels back down to a point where the country's actual income can support them. It's about restoring balance, and most important of all, restoring trust. This exact pattern, the debt buildup, the central bank spiral, and the painful reset, this has played out time and time again all throughout history, which leaves us with a pretty important question to think about, doesn't it? When you look at the world around us, where do you think we are in the cycle today? You know, we often think of a country's financial collapse as this sudden, shocking event, kind of like a lightning strike out of a clear blue sky. But what if it's not like that at all? What if it's actually more like a slow, predictable train wreck, one you can see coming for miles, if you just know what to look for? I mean, you've seen it, right? One day, everything seems kind of fine, and the next, the headlines are just screaming about currency crashes, bailouts, and total economic chaos. It feels so random. But what if I told you the data tells a completely different, much more predictable story? Turns out, across dozens of historical crises, countries almost always follow the exact same four-stage pattern. It's a journey down a path that's been walked many, many times before. So today, we're going to walk that path together and learn how to spot the warning signs for ourselves. All right, before we jump into the 4 stages, we need to get comfortable with the main tool we'll be using. We're going to be looking at a bunch of charts that average out the data from dozens of these historical debt crises. Now, here's the key to understanding all of this. See that timeline at the bottom of the charts? The number 0 is ground zero. That's the exact moment the crisis peaks. Think of it as a massive currency devaluation or a government debt default. Everything to the left of the zero shows you the months building up to the crisis, and everything to the right is the fallout. This setup is absolutely crucial because it lets us see the entire pattern unfold with incredible clarity. So, where does this all begin? Well, it starts with the party. Stage 1 is what we'll call the debt binge. This is where everyone, and I mean everyone, the government, companies, regular people, is borrowing like there's no tomorrow, convinced that the good times are just going to last forever. And here's what that party looks like on the government's tab. In the years leading up to that crisis point, you can just see government debt and the interest it has to pay on that debt climbing higher and higher. This isn't just borrowing for productive stuff like new highways. A lot of the time, it's just spending more than you make, digging a deeper and deeper hole. But look, the government isn't partying alone. The private sector, that's all the companies and households, is doing the exact same thing. Their debt also climbs to an absolute peak right at the moment the crisis hits. The big takeaway here is that the entire economy is becoming dangerously over-leveraged, together. All right, so what happens when the music stops? At some point, the private sector's party ends. The debts just become too much to handle. And when that happens, everyone looks to one place for a rescue, the government. This is stage 2, the great bailout. And this chart, wow, this shows the precise moment of the handover. Watch the red line, that's private debt. It suddenly hits a wall and rolls over. And at that exact same time, the blue line, government debt, just skyrockets. This is no coincidence. This is the great bailout in action, the moment private losses get transferred onto the public's credit card. If the last chart wasn't clear enough, check this one out. This tracks the ratio of government debt to private debt. For years, it's pretty stable, but then, right before the crisis, it goes completely vertical. This is one of the clearest warning signs you can possibly get. It's a massive, flashing red light that the financial burden has just been shifted onto the taxpayers. Okay, so the government has bailed everyone out, but now it has a huge problem of its own. It's suddenly stuck with a mountain of new debt, and the interest payments are starting to get really, really painful. Welcome to stage 3, the squeeze. And you can literally feel that squeeze right here on this chart. This rising line shows the government's interest payments eating up more and more of its income. It's like your mortgage and credit card bills suddenly eating up most of your paycheck. There's just less and less money left for everything else. You know, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. And at this stage, the math simply stops working. The solid lines on the chart show what has already happened. The dotted lines, that's the trajectory the country is now on. It is a path towards infinitely rising debt and interest costs. And you can bet that lenders, both at home and abroad, are looking at these exact same projections and getting very, very nervous. So what does a government do when the math just doesn't add up anymore? It gets creative, and not in a good way. It starts kicking the can down the road. They'll use accounting tricks to hide debt. They'll pressure local pension funds to buy their bonds. They might even launch these so-called patriotic campaigns asking citizens to help fund the government. But let's be clear, these are not signs of strength. They're signs of pure desperation. And that desperation brings us to the final chaotic act. The government has run out of tricks. The market can see the writing on the wall, and things start to unravel very, very quickly. This is stage 4, the breaking point. The source material we're looking at has a perfect name for this moment, the doom loop, and it's a vicious cycle. Nervous investors start selling the country's debt, which pushes interest rates up, but those higher rates then crush the economy, which forces the government to borrow even more money at even higher rates, and the loop just gets tighter and tighter. And here is that doom loop playing out in real time. On the left, you see the foreign investors getting spooked. They go from buying the country's debt to dumping it. The immediate result? Look at the chart on the right. The government is forced to jack up interest rates dramatically, trying to attract anyone, literally anyone at all, who is still willing to lend them money. And the consequences for the real economy are just brutal. On the left, you can see economic growth completely collapsing. And on the right, you can see the central bank just hemorrhaging its savings, desperately selling off its foreign currency reserves in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding and defend its own currency. At this point, the central bank is trapped. It faces an impossible no-win choice. Option A, let interest rates keep rising, which will absolutely guarantee a deep recession. Or option B, fire up the money printers, buy all the government debt themselves, and completely destroy the value of the currency through hyperinflation. There are simply no good options left. So there you have it. That's the four-stage journey of the train wreck. It goes from a debt-fueled party to a desperate bailout, a painful squeeze, and finally a chaotic breaking point. It's a remarkably consistent pattern that has played out time and time again throughout history. So let's just lock in that pattern one last time. Stage 1, the debt binge, for everyone. Stage 2, the great bailout, when private debt becomes public debt. Stage 3, the squeeze, when the government's own finances start to buckle. And Stage 4, the breaking point, when the doom loop kicks in. It's the same story almost every time. What we've walked through today isn't just a theory. It's a historical blueprint. The pattern repeats because, well, the fundamentals of debt and human behavior don't really change all that much. And that leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question. Now that you know the signs, where in the world do you see this journey happening right now? Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into the absolute endgame of a national debt crisis. This is the story of what happens when a government's money problems get so big, they land on the doorstep of the one place that can, supposedly, fix anything: the central bank. So let's just start with this really fundamental question. A country spends way more than it brings in, so it borrows. We get that. But what happens when nobody wants to lend it money anymore? Who's left to pick up the tab? And the answer? Well, it's the central bank. It becomes what's called the lender of last resort. When the government just can't find enough buyers for its debt, the whole crisis gets handed over to the central bank. And that's where our story really kicks into high gear, entering what the source material calls Stage 5. All right, so the central bank gets handed this giant, messy problem, and its first move is to pull out this incredibly powerful tool that looks like a magic wand, a super easy fix. It's what everyone calls money printing. But what is that really? The fancy term is quantitative easing, or just QE. And our source is really clear on this. They aren't literally firing up printing presses and making piles of cash. Nope. The central bank is creating new digital money out of thin air, and then it uses that new money to buy up all the government bonds that nobody else wants. Let's just walk through this. So step 1, the government needs cash, but investors are getting nervous. Step 2, in comes the central bank, acting as the big buyer. It scoops up those government bonds from commercial banks, and here's the key part. It pays for them by just creating new deposits in those banks' accounts. The effect at first seems great. The government gets funded, interest rates stay nice and low, and everything looks stable. For now. The author of our source material calls this a red flag. It's a huge warning sign that the government can't fund itself in the open market anymore. It's not a complete catastrophe yet because, let's face it, central banks are incredibly powerful. But a dangerous dependency has just been created. And these charts, wow, they show this so clearly. On the left, you can see in case after case, the central bank's ownership of government debt just starts shooting up. And on the right, you see another bad sign. The debt maturities get shorter. That just means the government has to borrow for shorter and shorter periods because lenders are too scared to lock up their money for the long haul. Both are screaming signs of stress in the system. And this leads us directly into Stage 6, because that solution, all that money printing to buy bonds, it creates a brand new, hidden problem. The central bank has basically walked right into a trap that it set for itself. And the trigger for that trap is this one simple question. The central bank bought tons of bonds when interest rates were super low. But what happens if inflation kicks in and it's forced to raise interest rates to protect the currency? And this slide just breaks down the problem perfectly. See, on the left, when rates were low, the central bank was actually making money. It earned more interest on the bonds it owned than it paid out. But on the right, when it has to jack up interest rates, the math completely flips. All of a sudden, it's paying out way more than it's taking in, and it starts bleeding money. You can think of it like a leaky bucket. The very assets the central bank bought to plug the hole in the government's finances are now springing a massive leak of their own. The rescuer is now the one who needs rescuing. And this is what brings us to the climax of the crisis. When the central bank is losing a ton of money and also has to raise interest rates, it can trigger this horrifying, self-reinforcing feedback loop. This is the death spiral. So here's the absolute heart of the problem. The The spiral really gets going when the central bank's losses are so big that it has only one way to cover them: print even more money. But doing that just pours gasoline on the original fire, making the currency even weaker. Okay, let's trace this vicious cycle. 1. The central bank is losing money. 2. It prints more money to fill the hole. 3. All that new money makes the currency worth less. 4. Investors see this, panic, and start dumping the currency and the government's bonds. 5. To stop them, the central bank has to raise interest rates even higher, which of course makes its own losses even bigger. And then the whole destructive loop starts all over again, but faster and more powerful each time.
This is the point of no return. The money printing is no longer a policy choice to help out the government. Now it's a matter of survival for the central bank itself. It is printing money just to stay afloat. And you can literally see the desperation in the data. This chart shows the central bank's hard assets. We're talking about its reserves of gold and foreign currencies, its ultimate rainy day fund. As investors flee, the bank is forced to sell off these precious reserves to try and prop up its own currency. You can see them just plummeting. It's the flashing red light that the bank is losing control.
Okay, so we've walked through that entire terrifying cycle from a seemingly simple solution all the way to a complete meltdown. What are the key takeaways? How can you actually spot these warning signs out in the real world? So let's just recap the breadcrumbs on this path. First, it kicks off with huge amounts of QE. That's the central bank buying up government debt. Then you start to see the government borrowing for shorter and shorter timeframes. The next major red flag is when the central bank itself starts reporting massive financial losses. And the final critical signal is when you see the country's foreign reserves start to drain away. When you see those things happening, you're watching the classic playbook of a major debt crisis unfold.
And that leaves us with one final big thought. This isn't just some story from a history textbook. This is a playbook for understanding what's happening right now. So as you look around at the global economy, how many of these signs can you spot playing out today?
You know, we hear the term all the time, a country going broke, but what does that actually mean? It's not like a company filing for bankruptcy. It's a chaotic, painful, and surprisingly predictable cycle. So today, let's trace that cycle. We're going to see exactly how a national debt crisis starts, how it explodes, and maybe most importantly, how it ends.
So what's the first real sign that an economy is truly hitting the wall? You might think it's some big announcement or a crazy headline, but usually it's something way more personal. It's the moment you realize the money in your wallet is suddenly becoming worthless. And this chart, this shows you that exact moment. See that cliff? That steep, stomach-dropping plunge? That is the breaking point. It's what's known as a devaluation, and it's basically the financial system screaming that the game is over. The old rules just don't apply anymore.
Now, this great devaluation is what kicks off a whole process called deleveraging. Just think of it like a giant, painful reset for the entire economy. It's messy, but it's necessary. It forces everyone, governments, companies, people, to finally deal with all that debt. And it triggers this massive scramble as people try to protect whatever wealth they have left.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On the left, there's your currency, collapsing. And on the right, look at what happens to gold at the exact same time. It just skyrockets. It's so logical, right? As your cash becomes trash, you desperately try to trade it for something real, something that holds its value. Gold, commodities, even stocks. It's that classic flight to safety, and you can see it right here. So what actually survives a crash like this? Well, the data is pretty clear. Hard assets, things you can actually touch, like gold and commodities, do really well. Even stocks, because they represent a piece of a real business, tend to hold up okay. But look at the bottom of the list, government bonds. The one thing that's supposed to be the safest investment on the planet actually loses money. The irony is just staggering. The very debt that's causing the crisis is one of the worst things you can possibly own.
And hey, this isn't just some theory, this is history. Look at these numbers from some of the biggest crises ever. Weimar Germany, bonds got completely wiped out, a minus 99% return. The Great Depression in the US, gold went up almost 150%. This pattern just repeats itself over and over again. History tells us exactly where people run when the system breaks.
Okay, so how does a government even get into a mess this big? It all comes down to something called monetizing the debt.
Basically, it means the government has spent way too much money and nobody will lend them anymore. So what do? They turn to their own central bank and pretty much force it to print new money to buy the government's bonds. It's literally like trying to pay off your credit card bill by printing monopoly money in your basement. It might solve your problem for a day, but it has one huge disastrous side effect: inflation. And this chart shows you that classic, predictable two-step dance. First, you see the government debt start to surge. That's the spending spree. Then, right after, once the problem gets too big to ignore, you see the money printing kick in to cover it. It's a fiscal problem getting papered over with a monetary solution that only makes things worse. So, faced with this kind of crisis, do governments just sit there? No way. They get desperate. And desperate governments, well, they do desperate things to get their hands on any cash they can possibly find. One of the very first moves they make is to jack up taxes a lot. As you can see here, things like income taxes and inheritance taxes tend to just shoot through the roof. The government is bleeding cash, and its own citizens, well, they become the easiest piggy bank to raid. Now, put yourself in that situation for a second. Your money is losing value by the day, and the government is trying to take a bigger chunk of what's left. What's your next logical move? You try to get your money out of there. People and businesses start desperately looking for ways to move their wealth to a safer country, somewhere with a stable currency. This is what we call capital flight. And of course, the government sees this coming. They can't let all that money escape. So, to stop the bleeding, they slam the door shut. They impose what are called capital controls, which basically make it illegal or next to impossible to move your money abroad. It's a trap, really. First, they raise your taxes, and then they lock the exits so you can't escape with what's left. I know, this all sounds incredibly bleak, but this isn't actually the end of the story. The crisis does, eventually, hit a bottom. And from there, believe it or not, there's a well-worn 5-step path that countries take to climb out of the wreckage and start a brand new cycle. So how do you pull a country out of a nosedive like this? It usually comes down to these 5 steps. They're painful, but they're necessary. 1, you've got to restructure the debt. 2, the government has to make serious cuts, real fiscal adjustments. 3, you have to rebuild your savings, your foreign reserves. 4, you make your currency attractive again with really high interest rates. And 5, you put a leash on the central bank so this can't happen again. Let's break those down. This waterfall chart is fantastic because it shows you exactly how that huge mountain of debt gets whittled down. You can see how little chunks are taken out by things like economic growth and even some defaults. But just look at the size of that second green bar. It's massive. That's right. That giant green bar is inflation. It is by far the biggest tool governments use to get out from under their debt. On average, it erases a staggering 38% of the debt's value. This is basically a silent default. The government pays you back every dollar they promised, sure, but by the time you get it, each one of those dollars is worth way, way less. All right, next up, the government has to take its medicine. They're finally forced to do what they probably should have been doing all along: cut spending and get their budget deficit under control. You can see right here on the chart how the deficit hits rock bottom at the peak of the crisis, and then it starts that long, slow climb back to something that actually looks sustainable. Another really crucial sign that things are getting better is when the country starts rebuilding its foreign currency reserves. You can see here how those reserves just get decimated as the central bank sells them off trying to prop up the currency. But after the devaluation, they start to climb again. It's like the country is refilling its national savings account, and that sends a huge signal to the rest of the world that stability is finally returning. And now for the really tough medicine. To restore any faith in the currency and stop it from falling further, the central bank has no choice but to hike interest rates, often dramatically. You can see that huge spike right at the crisis point. This does 2 things. It makes it attractive for people to hold the currency, and it makes it really expensive to bet against it. Now, it's incredibly painful for regular people and businesses who need to borrow money, but it's a necessary evil to finally stabilize the whole system. So after all of this, the devaluation, the crazy inflation, the tax hikes, the sky-high interest rates, after all that pain, the storm finally passes. The debt is manageable again, the books are balanced, and the economy can, at long last, start to heal. And this sets the stage for a whole new cycle of growth to begin. This quote from the research really just nails it. The recovery isn't one single event. It's this messy combination of brutal market forces and tough, necessary decisions by politicians that finally creates a bottom.
And it's only from that bottom that a new beginning can actually start.
So I think the big takeaway here is that this whole destructive-looking process actually serves a purpose. It's a violent, painful reset that just washes away all the crazy mistakes and excesses of the last cycle. It brutally restores a sense of balance, and in doing so, it lays a new, more stable foundation for the economy to start growing again. And that brings us to the final, lingering question, doesn't it? This whole painful process brings the old crisis to an end. But as memories of the pain start to fade and a new cycle of borrowing and spending inevitably begins, you have to wonder, does the end of one crisis do nothing more than plant the seeds for the next one?
So today we're going to break down a really powerful framework for understanding, well, pretty much everything. From economic booms and busts to the rise and fall of entire nations, it's called the overall big cycle. And honestly, it might just change how you see the world.
You know, it's a question a lot of us have probably asked ourselves. You see the headlines, debt crises, deep political divisions, tensions between countries, and you just get this feeling of déjà vu. Is it all just random chaos, or is there actually a pattern to it all?
And the way the author of our source material puts it is fascinating. He says history isn't just a bunch of random events. It's more like we're watching a movie that we've seen over and over again. Sure, the actors are different, the technology's new, but the basic plot, the underlying script, it stays pretty much the same.
Okay, so if history really is like a recurring movie, what's the plot? Well, the author calls it the overall big cycle. Let's break down what that actually means. So what is this big cycle? Think of it like a template or a roadmap. It maps out these predictable cause and effect relationships that have driven history for centuries. It's a way of looking at the mechanics behind why great powers rise and why they eventually fall.
So if history is this big machine, what are the gears that make it all turn? Well, this model boils it all down to 5 key forces that are constantly interacting and pushing things forward.
These 5 forces are basically the engine of history. First, you've got the economic cycle. That's all about money, credit, and debt. This almost always fuels number 2, the internal conflict cycle, which is the struggle for power inside a country. That, of course, spills over to the external conflict cycle, or how countries deal with each other. And then you have 2 wild cards, acts of nature, like a pandemic, and the constant game changer, human inventiveness, new technology.
We're going to start with what happens inside a country, because this is often where the really big shifts get their start. It's like a chain reaction that begins with money and can end with massive political change.
So a lot of the time, the whole cycle gets kicked off when a country just racks up a ton of debt, way more than it can realistically handle. And we're not just talking about numbers on a page. This creates real painful economic stress for everyday people and for the government itself.
And here's the critical link. That economic pain, it doesn't just stay in the economy. No, it bleeds over into society. It makes disagreements worse, it widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and it deepens the divides between political tribes. It turns financial stress into a full-blown social and political fight.
Now think about it. For a democracy to work, people have to be willing to compromise. But when those gaps in wealth and values get really extreme, that willingness to find common ground just breaks down. Each side digs in, convinced that winning is way more important than keeping the system afloat.
And this kind of chaotic environment, well, it's the perfect breeding ground for a very specific type of leader to emerge, the demagogue. This is someone who taps into all that public anger, promises to fix everything with easy answers, and often attacks the very democratic rules that are supposed to keep them in check.
And hey, this isn't some abstract theory. We've seen this exact movie play out again and again throughout history. I mean, think about Julius Caesar turning the Roman Republic into an empire, or in more modern times, leaders like Hitler and Mussolini rising to power in Europe. History shows us this pattern is very, very real.
Okay, so as things are getting shaken up inside a country, that has a huge ripple effect on how that country deals with the rest of the world. The whole global order starts to swing like a giant pendulum.
And this pendulum swings between 2 extremes. On one side, you have multilateralism. That's when countries are generally trying to get along, following rules and cooperating. But then it swings to the other side, unilateralism. That's a survival of the fittest world, where it's all about power, conflict, and every nation for itself. And the author's take is that we're swinging hard toward that conflict side right now.
All right, so on top of these big, predictable cycles, you've got a couple of wild cards that can really shake things up. And there's also this one really powerful positive trend that's always working in the background.
Think of these two forces as accelerants. An act of nature, like a massive climate event or a global pandemic, can suddenly put incredible stress on the whole system and speed up the cycle. And at the same time, human inventiveness, a revolutionary new technology like AI, can totally rewrite the rules of power and wealth, completely disrupting the old order.
So you've got all this chaos, right? These short-term ups and downs, these giant long-term cycles of empires rising and falling. It can all feel pretty overwhelming. But if you zoom way, way out, you see the single most important part of this entire picture. Just look at that straight line cutting right through all that noise. While everything else is going up and down in these crazy cycles, that line is always moving up. That line is productivity. It's us. It's our collective ability to learn, to create, and to invent. And despite all the turmoil, that's what ultimately raises living standards for everyone in the long run.
Okay, so that's the model. It's a powerful way to look at the past. But I know what you're thinking. What does it say about right now?
Well, according to this framework, we are smack in the middle of what's called Stage 5, and that's the late stage of the big cycle. It has all the hallmarks we just talked about: massive debt levels, deep political divisions inside countries, and rising conflict between countries. It's a time of really high risk and a whole lot of change.
So after all that, after exploring this giant, complex machine of history with all of its cycles and forces, the author boils it all down to something incredibly simple. The ultimate driver, the force that decides whether we get through these tough times or fall into crisis, is just us. It's how we choose to deal with one another.
And that really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? The cycle sets the stage. It lays out the challenges, but it doesn't write the final scene. The patterns of history show us the dangers, but the outcome isn't written in stone. In the end, it all depends on the choices that we make.
Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating 80-year chunk of history, from the end of the U.S. Civil War all the way to the end of World War II. And what's so wild about this period is that it seems to reveal this powerful, almost predictable pattern that shapes how nations rise and fall. So yeah, let's get right into it.
So here's the big question, right? Is history just one random thing after another? Or does it actually follow a rhythm? You know, a cycle of boom, bust, and conflict that just kind of repeats itself over and over again. Well, the framework we're looking at today argues that, yeah, it absolutely does.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the blueprint for this big cycle. Then, we're going to see how this exact same pattern played out, not once, but twice during this really pivotal 80-year period. First leading from the Civil War to World War I, and then, you guessed it, again from World War I to World War II.
All right, first things first. Let's get our heads around the theory itself. You can think of this as the master blueprint, a 6-stage roadmap that's going to help us understand everything that follows. It's the core idea of how a nation goes from peace and prosperity all the way to conflict and collapse, and then somehow back again.
Okay, so here are the 6 stages. It all kicks off with a new order, usually established right after a big war. This leads to a period of peace and productivity. Think incredible invention, lots of economic growth. But that boom is almost always fueled by borrowing, which creates a massive debt bubble. Then, as some people get incredibly rich, a huge wealth gap opens up, and that creates a lot of social tension. Eventually, that bubble has to burst, leading to a bust and depression. And finally, all that economic pain fuels both internal and external conflict, which leads to another war, and that resets the entire cycle. So now, let's see this template in action. Okay, let's put this template to the test. Our first case study starts in 1865, right as the U.S. Civil War is ending. Now, according to our blueprint, a major war is just wrapped up, which should put us at the very, very beginning of a brand new cycle.
And sure enough, that's exactly what we see. The war was unbelievably expensive. To pay for it, the government just printed huge amounts of money that wasn't backed by gold. They called them greenbacks. And the result? The value of that money just cratered. Inflation shot up to 80%. The country was drowning in debt. But with the war over, the stage was set for a totally fresh start.
And this is Stage 2, peace and productivity. And man, what a productive time it was. The late 1800s gave us the second industrial revolution. You had railroads stitching the whole country together. Steel let cities build up, creating skyscrapers. Electricity, the light bulb, the telephone. I mean, these weren't just little inventions. They completely changed society. It was an absolutely incredible, debt-financed boom.
This slide really shows you the two sides of the same coin. On one hand, you had the Gilded Age, where these so-called robber barons made just insane fortunes. But that prosperity was not for everyone, which brings us to stages 3 and 4, the debt bubble and the wealth gap. The Panic of 1873 kicked off what was called the Long Depression, a really tough period of debt, busts, and suffering for a lot of people. You could just feel the tension between the super rich and everyone else struggling to get by.
And you can see on this timeline how all that pressure just kept building and building. After that first panic in 1873, another really bad one hit in 1907. This whole boom-bust thing was so violent that the government actually created the Federal Reserve in 1913 just to try and control it. But these economic problems at home, combined with growing tensions overseas, it was all too much. In 1914, World War I broke out, ending this cycle in this huge global conflict, just like the template says it should. Okay, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Because after that devastating war ends in 1918, the cycle, well, it just starts all over again. A new world order is born, and the pattern we just saw begins to repeat itself with this kind of spooky similarity. And bam! Here we are again, right back at stage 2, peace and productivity. The roaring 20s were another time of just explosive innovation. The car went from being a toy for the rich to something everyone had. Commercial airplanes started flying. Radios and talking movies connected the world in brand new ways. And just like before, this amazing boom was built on a mountain of credit and speculation.
And you know what comes next, right? The boom always leads to the bust. Stage 5. What started as productive investment had turned into this giant speculative bubble. And in 1929, that bubble burst in the most spectacular way, with the stock market crash, which threw the US and the entire world into the Great Depression. It was the worst economic crisis in modern history.
The debt crisis got so bad that governments had to do something drastic. So, in 1933, President Roosevelt basically broke the promise to exchange dollars for gold, which devalued the currency by about 40%. Now, this wasn't some random decision. It was a predictable response to a huge problem, and it points to a core principle of this entire cycle.
Okay, let's hit pause on the history for just a second to really focus on the engine that drives this whole cycle. When debts get way too big to be paid back with normal, sound money, what do governments always do?
So here's the crucial takeaway. When the debt burden just becomes impossible, governments are forced to break their promises. They have to find a way to make the debt smaller compared to everything else, and they have a standard playbook they turn to when this happens.
And that playbook usually has 3 main moves. 1, they print a ton of money. 2, they restructure the debt, which is a nice way of saying they reduce what's owed. And 3, they often try to control or even outlaw hard money, stuff like gold that has its own value, because they don't want people fleeing from the currency they're devaluing. When Roosevelt devalued the dollar and outlawed private gold ownership in 1933, he was following the script to the letter.
All right, back to our story. The world is stuck in the Great Depression, and all of that economic pain starts to ignite the final stage of the cycle, really intense conflict both at home and abroad.
Inside these countries, the 1930s saw this extreme polarization. In places like Germany, Italy, and Japan, you had these powerful leaders on the hard right, the fascists, who came to power promising to restore order. At the exact same time, you had communism on the hard left gaining a ton of influence, framing the whole thing as a fight between the poor masses and the rich elites. Any middle ground just disappeared, and the world split into these warring ideological camps.
And that same fight was happening on the world stage. You had rising, aggressive powers like Germany and Japan starting to challenge the old world order. The established powers, Britain and France, were still really weak from the First World War, and they just couldn't defend their global empires anymore. The rising powers saw that weakness and they took advantage of it, grabbing territory and pushing the whole world closer and closer to war.
And, well, this all inevitably led to the ultimate conflict. World War II was the final result of all these economic, internal, and external pressures building up. It was the devastating war that finally ended the cycle, blew up the old system, and, after it was all over in 1945, set the stage for a new one to begin. The pattern was complete. Again.
So after seeing this 80-year story play out in 2 very distinct but almost identical cycles, we're left with one single unavoidable question. If this template of boom, bust, and conflict is truly how the world works, we have to ask ourselves, Where are we in the cycle today?
Today, we're diving into something huge, something that's almost invisible but shapes our entire economic world. We're talking about these massive, long-term cycles of debt that have been repeating for centuries, and we're going to break down exactly how they work. You ever wonder why our economic history just feels like this endless roller coaster of incredible booms followed by devastating busts? It can seem totally random, right? But what if it's not? What if there's an underlying pattern, a kind of script that economies have been following for decades? Well, that's the big mystery we're going to try and solve. And the key to unlocking it all is this idea called the big debt cycle. The best way to think about it is like a very, very slow-moving economic tide. Over decades, debt and credit, that's the water, it slowly rises, and that rising tide lifts all boats, fueling growth and prosperity. But eventually, that tide gets way too high. The debt becomes a huge weight, and the whole system has to reset. And it seems we've been in one of these cycles for about 80 years now. To really get this, we've got to start with Act 1. Let's call it the debt switch. It's a story that stars two main characters: the debt held by the private sector, that's regular people and businesses, and the debt held by the government. Okay, so check out this red line. This shows private debt in the US, mortgages, car loans, business loans, all that stuff, as a piece of the whole economy. See how it just builds and builds for decades, fueling all this growth? But then, bam, it hits this massive peak right around 2008. After that crisis, everyone, households, companies, they all started paying down that debt like crazy. It's a process called deleveraging. So with the private sector stepping back, who jumped in to keep the whole thing from falling apart? You guessed it, the government. This chart shows us US government debt. Just look at that insane upward climb right after 2008. The government basically opened the floodgates, borrowing and spending on a massive scale to stop a complete meltdown. And when you put both of those lines on the same chart, the switch becomes crystal clear. It's almost a perfect mirror image. As the red line of private debt finally goes down, the blue line of government debt just shoots for the moon. The debt burden was literally handed off from families and businesses to the government. And that move, that's a textbook play from the late stages of a big debt cycle. All right, so if we are in the late stage of a cycle, how do we really know? Let's move on to Act 2 and check out what I'm calling our detective's dashboard. These are the key warning signs, the flashing lights that tell us exactly where we are in this 80-year pattern. I'm just going to throw a number at you. 150%. What in the world could that mean? I mean, think about it. What happens when a government's bills, its IOUs, reach 150% of its total income? Well, here's what it means. This chart shows the U.S. government's debt payments, the interest it has to pay, known as debt service, as a percentage of its tax revenue. Those dots, those are the future projections. And they show that within about 15 years, the government's debt payments are on track to be 1.5 times all the money it brings in. Put simply, its debt bill is going to be way, way bigger than its entire income. Let's make that personal for a second. Just imagine your own budget. What if your mortgage, your car payment, and all your credit card bills added up to 50% more than your entire yearly salary? It's completely unthinkable. It is not sustainable. And yet, that's the path these projections are currently showing. Now, for the last 40 years, there was always an escape hatch. This chart shows interest rates in blue and inflation in red. See that peak way back in the early 1980s? Well, ever since then, central banks have been able to just keep lowering interest rates. Every single time the economy got a little wobbly, they could just cut rates, make borrowing cheaper, and keep the party going. But you see the problem, right? Look where that blue line ends up, around 2020. Flat on the floor, at zero. And this brings us to what some people say is the single most important number to watch: the real yield. It's actually pretty simple. It's just the interest rate you got on your savings minus the rate of inflation. It tells you whether you're actually getting richer by saving money or if inflation is secretly eating away at your returns. When the real yield is super low or even negative, it is a fantastic time to be a borrower and a really terrible time to be a lender or a saver. And for decades, central banks pushed this number lower and lower to get us all to borrow and spend. So, what happens when that escape hatch, the ability to lower interest rates, is locked shut? This brings us to Act 3, the endgame mechanic. This is that critical moment in the cycle when all the standard tools stop working and something totally different has to happen. So here's the setup. In normal times, right, if the economy is looking weak, the central bank just cuts interest rates. Easy peasy. But in a massive crisis at the end of a long debt cycle, interest rates are already sitting at zero.
You literally can't cut them any further. The number one tool in the toolbox is broken.
This is really the multi-trillion-dollar question. With their main weapon totally out of commission, what do policymakers do to stop the entire system from just seizing up? Well, history gives us a pretty clear answer. The blue line here shows short-term interest rates. The red line, that's basically a measure of money printing. Now, watch what happens. Twice in the last 100 years, interest rates have slammed into zero. First, after the 1929 crash, and second, after the 2008 financial crisis. And what happens both times? The red line goes vertical. Central banks start printing money on an unbelievable scale to buy up government debt. This is not a new trick. It is the recurring endgame of the big debt cycle. Now, it's really tempting to look at all this and think, okay, that's one country's problem. But as we're about to see, this has become a truly global story. The whole playbook we just walked through, the debt switch from private to public, hitting zero on interest rates, and then firing up the printing presses, that is not unique to the United States. Not at all. This exact same pattern is playing out all across the developed world. I mean, just look at these projections. They really show you the scale of this thing. Government debt is forecast to just keep on climbing, almost everywhere you look. Across the whole world, in the G7 major economies, in China, in Japan. With very few exceptions, nearly every major economy is on the same path. So let's just do a super quick recap of our journey. We've seen that economies move in these huge 80-year waves of debt. We saw how the debt burden can literally switch from the private sector to the government. We identified rising debt payments as that critical flashing red light. We learned that when interest rates hit the floor, money printing is the final play. And last, we've seen that this isn't just one country's issue. It's now a coordinated global challenge. Which leaves us with one last pretty profound question. With governments all over the world marching down this exact same path, with debt levels soaring and the endgame mechanics already fired up, are we now watching the final stages of this 80-year cycle play out in real time? Today, we're going to dive into one of the most important days in modern economic history. Seriously, a day when the very nature of money was changed forever by a single, shocking announcement on TV. Let's get right into it. So picture this. It's a quiet Sunday evening. You turn on the TV and there's the President of the United States. And with just one speech, he completely upends the financial system the entire world had been using for decades. That promise, the one that said a US dollar was as good as gold, well, it was gone. Just like that, overnight. So you have to ask, right? How did a system that was literally designed for stability after World War II just completely fall apart? And, more importantly, what can this incredible story teach us about debt, money, and power right now, in our own time? To really get it, we've got to rewind the clock. Okay, so our story really kicks off back in 1944. The world is just a mess after World War II, and the Allied powers all meet up in a little town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission? To build a brand new, stable financial order from the ground up, to make sure the kind of economic chaos that led to the war could never, ever happen again. The solution they came up with was the Bretton Woods system. The idea behind it was actually pretty simple, but it was powerful. The US dollar was directly tied to gold at a fixed rate. So you can think of dollars as basically being claim checks that you could, in theory, cash in for actual physical gold. Every other major currency was then pegged to the dollar. So here's how the game was set up, with the US right at the center of the whole thing. America had a huge advantage. It held most of the world's gold. So naturally, the dollar became the world's go-to currency. Other countries' central banks could trade in their dollars for US gold, which was supposed to keep the whole system honest. But get this, and this is a fascinating little detail. Regular American citizens were actually forbidden from owning gold. The government needed their using dollars, not hoarding the real stuff. But this shiny gold-plated system had a huge, fatal flaw baked right into its DNA from day one. It was all built on a promise that, as history has shown us again and again, is almost impossible for any government to keep over the long run. You see, the problem really boils down to something very human. Even when your money is supposedly linked to gold, the temptation for politicians to spend more than they actually have is just, it's too strong. Governments always, inevitably, start creating more paper promises, more dollars, than the gold they have sitting in the vault. And this predictable behavior leads to what you could call a monetary doom loop.
First, the government spends way too much. Then people, or in this case other countries, start to get a little nervous. They realize there are way more paper claims on the gold than actual gold in the bank. And that's when the fear spreads, and you get a classic run on the bank, where everyone tries to get their real money, the gold, all at once. And eventually, the government is forced to slam the door shut and break its promise.
And listen, this wasn't just some abstract theory. The whole world had a front row seat to this exact thing happening with the world's previous superpower, the British Empire. Its decline was a crystal clear, almost chilling preview of what was coming for the US.
I mean, just look at this timeline. After the war, Britain was absolutely drowning in debt. That led to it having to devalue its currency multiple times. Then crises like the one at the Suez Canal showed the world it was losing its power, so investors started dumping its bonds. And by 1976, the former global empire had to go cap in hand to the IMF for a bailout. This was the classic, painful decline of a major currency playing out for everyone to see.
And that brings us right back to the United States in the 1960s. Because just like the British Empire became too expensive for Britain to afford, America's own ambitions started to put massive cracks in the very financial system it had created.
The U.S. was basically fighting a war on two fronts. You had the guns of the Vietnam War overseas and the butter of huge social programs back home. Now, to pay for all this, the government had to borrow and print more and more dollars, way more than it had gold to back them up. It was literally writing checks that it knew it couldn't cash.
Now, other countries, they weren't stupid. They saw the U.S. spending like crazy, and they started to get pretty nervous. So what do? They started cashing in their big piles of dollars for U.S. gold. And as you can see here, America's gold reserves just started pouring out of the country at a really alarming rate. So yeah, that doom loop we talked about, it was now in full swing. Countries like France were openly questioning whether the U.S. could actually keep its promise, and he started sending ships to literally pick up their gold. The run on the U.S. Treasury had begun.
This all boiled over in the summer of 1971. Gold was just flying out of the vaults, the reserves were hitting critical lows, and the U.S. government was backed into a corner. It had to make a choice, and it had to make it fast. And so President Nixon got on national television and did what was previously unthinkable. He just unilaterally cut the dollar's final tie to gold. He essentially ended the Bretton Woods system with one announcement. He defaulted on the very promise that had been the foundation of the global economy for almost 30 years.
Now, you'd think this would cause an absolute meltdown in the markets, right? I mean, a default is a disaster. But the very next day, the stock market had its best day of the entire year, jumping up over 3%. So, what was going on? Why were investors celebrating? Well, it's because this wasn't some new, crazy idea. History was just rhyming. Nixon was basically using the exact same playbook that President Roosevelt had used decades earlier. See, back in 1933, during the Great Depression, Roosevelt faced a bank run from his own citizens, so he broke the promise to exchange their dollars for gold. In both cases, the reason was the same. The default lets the government print a ton of money and stimulate a struggling economy.
So, what's the big lesson here? What's the fundamental takeaway from this whole incredible drama?
Well, it all comes down to this really powerful principle. Whenever a country's debt gets so big that it becomes truly painful, the central bank will almost always choose to create more money. It's just the easiest way out politically. It makes the debt easier to pay off, sure, but it does that by making the money that everyone holds worth less. It means the cash in your wallet just doesn't buy as much as it used to.
And that right there, that explains why the stock market shot up in 1971. When the dollar itself becomes worth less, the price of real assets that are priced in dollars, things like stocks, commodities, gold, they have to go up. So breaking the promise, while technically a default, also acted as a massive stimulus for the economy.
Which brings us to the final and most critical question. The cycle of piling on debt, then printing money, and then devaluing the currency, it's not some one-off event from the past. It's a pattern that we see repeated over and over again throughout history. So looking at the world around us today, the question we all have to ask ourselves is, are we seeing it happen all over again?
All right, let's get right into it. We're about to unpack a 37-year story that, believe it or not, completely rewired our entire global economy. It's really a story about a massive experiment that kicked off back in 1971. And its aftershocks, well, they're still shaping pretty much every aspect of our financial lives today. You know, this whole thing really boils down to one simple but absolutely earth-shattering question. What happens when the very thing our economy runs on, money, is no longer tied to anything physical? What happens when it has no limits?
Well, the story of how we found out begins on one single fateful day in August of 1971. President Nixon gets on television, looks the world in the eye, and announces that the U.S. dollar will no longer be convertible to gold. And just like that, in that moment, he cut the cord. The entire global money system changed, literally forever.
And with that, we entered the age of what's called fiat money. All that means is that a currency is valuable just because a government says it is. But here's the really crucial part. This meant that central banks, like the Federal Reserve, were suddenly unleashed. They could now create money based on what they thought was best for the economy, not based on how much gold they had sitting in a vault.
So, what was the immediate result of all this newfound freedom? Well, in a word, chaos. The 1970s quickly became this miserable economic decade known as stagflation, which is this really toxic cocktail of a stagnant, dead-in-the-water economy and, at the same time, runaway inflation.
In a world like that, with inflation just running wild, you get some very clear winners and some very clear losers. Think about it. If you owed money, say you had a mortgage on your house, you were actually kind of lucky, because you're paying back that big loan with dollars that were worth less and less every single year. But if you were a saver or anyone who lent money out, man, you were getting absolutely crushed. The cash you were getting back was losing its buying power fast.
And this chart right here just perfectly illustrates the problem for savers. What we're looking at is the real return on your money. That's the interest you earn after you subtract inflation. And look at that line for most of the 1970s. It's below zero. That means even with the interest you were making, your savings were actually buying you less stuff over time. You were literally getting poorer by trying to save your money. It's just wild.
Now, as if this giant monetary experiment wasn't enough, the world then got hit with a series of geopolitical earthquakes. You had massive post-colonial shifts in the Middle East, the huge oil crisis and embargo in 1973, and then a second oil shock after the Iranian Revolution. It was like pouring gasoline on an already raging inflationary fire.
So by the end of the decade, the combination of high inflation, a weak economy, and all this global crisis, it just became completely intolerable. The public, politicians, everyone had just decided enough was enough.
Something had to change, and the change that was coming was going to be so dramatic that it led the German chancellor at the time, Helmut Schmidt, to say the world was about to see the highest interest rates since the birth of Jesus Christ. And honestly, he wasn't exaggerating by much.
And this brings us to 1979 and the appointment of our next major character, a new Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker. He was brought in with one single, brutal mission: kill inflation, no matter what it took. He was literally about to slam the brakes on the entire economy.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is the moment Volcker takes the wheel. See that arrow? Now watch the red line. That's the average interest rate. It just goes nearly vertical. It rockets up to levels nobody had ever seen before, all in an effort to get ahead of that runaway inflation, which is the blue line. That was the shock.
And you know what? The shock worked. I mean, yes, it triggered a really painful recession, but it broke the back of inflation. And this kicked off a complete reversal. The 1980s and 90s became this era of falling inflation, a growing economy, and markets that were just on fire. It was what some have called a capitalist delight, especially for anyone who owned financial assets, because stocks and bonds were about to begin a historic, decades-long bull run.
The contrast here is it's night and day. On the left, you see the pure chaos of the 70s, with inflation and interest rates just spiraling up and up. Then, on the right, you see the result of the Volcker shock. Interest rates spike, crush inflation, and then begin this long, steady decline that would last for decades.
And this huge monetary shift was happening at the same time as a huge political one. You had conservative leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher come into power. Their playbook was all about fighting wage inflation and cutting taxes. So you combine that with falling interest rates, and you have a perfect storm for corporate profits to soar, which in turn sent the stock and bond markets into overdrive. But here's the ironic twist. This long cycle of falling interest rates, the very thing that solved the problems of the 70s, it started creating a whole new set of problems of its own. As we rolled into the 2000s,
the system really started to show some cracks.
A really dangerous pattern started to emerge. Every time the economy would stumble, the Fed would cut interest rates to stimulate growth. But with rates always trending lower and lower, all that cheap money had to go somewhere. So it fueled a series of massive asset bubbles. First in dot-com stocks. And then, after that burst, it fueled an even more catastrophic bubble in housing.
And this brings us to the end of the line. After the 2008 housing bubble burst and the global financial crisis hit, the Fed did what it always did. It cut interest rates. But this time was different. As you can see right here, after a 27-year-long decline, rates finally hit the floor, rock bottom, 0%. The main tool they had was now completely exhausted.
And so, just like that, the 37-year experiment was over. The playbook that had guided the global economy since the 1970s was now totally useless. This left the world's financial leaders just staring into the abyss, facing a brand new, incredibly urgent question. What on earth do we do now?
Let's go back to 2008 for a second. The entire global financial system was, well, it was this close to collapsing. It really felt like the whole world was standing on the edge of a cliff. And the crazy thing is, it all started pretty quietly in the US mortgage market, but it was about to pull everyone down with it. So in this moment of just complete panic, policymakers do what they always do. They reach for their emergency toolkit, the one they've used for generations to fight off recessions. But this time, they opened the box and it was empty. The old tools were broken. So, in this explainer, we're going to trace that whole story. How do we go from the absolute brink of collapse to this radical, world-changing solution that was deployed? And maybe more importantly, how are the aftershocks of that one decision still shaping our lives today?
Okay, so here's the plan. First, we'll dive into the meltdown itself and see exactly how the old economic rules just shattered. Then we'll explore the birth of a brand new system, central banks printing money. From there, we'll unpack the unintended consequences, check out the painful lesson from the Eurozone as a comparison, and finally, we'll zoom out and see how this all fits into a much, much bigger historical cycle.
So first up, the 2008 financial meltdown. And we really need to appreciate the scale of what happened here. This wasn't just some minor downturn, not at all. This was a once-in-a-generation economic catastrophe that had people drawing comparisons to the Great Depression.
So what kicked this all off? A giant mountain of debt, built on a really shaky foundation of mortgages and real estate. But the problem was, it didn't stay there. It spread like a virus through the entire global financial system. In the US, unemployment shot up to 10%. Stock markets all around the world were basically cut in half. I mean, for millions of people, it literally felt like the floor had just vanished from beneath them.
And that right there brings us to the real turning point in this whole story. Look, the crash itself was bad, obviously. But the slow dawning realization that the traditional ways of fixing it were completely useless, that was terrifying.
Okay, now what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows the #1 weapon central banks have to fight a recession. It's called Monetary Policy 1. You just cut interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, which encourages people and businesses to spend and invest. But look at what happened in late 2008. See that red line? It just slams right into the floor. It hit zero. And you can't cut rates below zero. The main tool was now completely broken.
So this was the billion-dollar question facing every world leader. With your main lever totally jammed, what on earth could you possibly do to stop the freefall? Well, their answer was something radical, super controversial, and it would end up defining the entire next decade. They had to move to a completely new system, monetary policy 2.
So, here's the crucial point. If you can't encourage new borrowing by cutting short-term interest rates, the central bank can step in and basically force down long-term rates. How? By creating new money, literally out of thin air, and using it to buy financial assets, mostly government debt. The whole idea was to flood the system with cash and make it cheaper for everyone to borrow and spend. This whole process is known as quantitative easing, or QE for short.
And you can see the sheer scale of that decision right here. I mean, wow. This chart shows the U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet. You can just think of it as how many assets it owns. For decades, it's a pretty flat, boring line. Then, in late 2008, the exact moment interest rates hit zero, it just goes vertical. That's the money printer kicking into high gear.
And just to put this in perspective, this wasn't some minor policy tweak.
This was a break glass in case of emergency move that hadn't been seen on this kind of scale since the absolute depths of the Great Depression, a full 75 years earlier. They were literally rewriting the economic playbook in real time.
But while QE might have saved the financial system from a total meltdown, it came with a whole host of really complex and pretty divisive consequences that started to ripple out through society.
So why does this matter? Well, think about it. All that newly printed money had to go somewhere. It flowed into financial markets, pushing up the prices of stocks and bonds. Now, that was great news if you were wealthy and you already owned those assets. But for everyone else, it felt very different. People were seeing banks get bailed out while they were losing their jobs. It just fueled this powerful perception that the whole system was rigged to protect the rich, and it created this deep sense of anger and resentment.
And this timeline really shows how that economic anger just boiled over into a political firestorm. This is not a coincidence. The crisis and the policy response to it directly fed into a new wave of political movements. You had the Tea Party on the right, you had Occupy Wall Street on the left. But both were tapping into the same exact feeling, that the elites were no longer working for the common person. And this populist wave would ultimately reshape the entire political landscape, culminating in events like the 2016 US election.
Now, to really understand the incredible power of money printing, it helps to look at what happened to countries that faced the exact same crisis but couldn't use this tool.
And this slide just makes the contrast crystal clear. You have the United States, which had a massive debt problem, but because its debt was in US dollars, its central bank could just print dollars to manage the crisis. The result? They engineered a recovery. Then you have Greece. They also had a massive debt problem, but their debt was in euros, a currency they had absolutely no control over, no power to print. The result for them? Years of painful budget cuts, known as austerity, which led to a brutal depression.
This was the painful path a country has to take when it tries to reduce its debt without a money printer. You can see the vicious cycle here. The crisis leads to austerity, which is when the government is forced to slash spending. But that just crushes the economy, which in turn makes the debt problem even worse. It's a downward spiral that eventually led to citizens pulling all their money from banks, what we call bank runs, and the government having to impose capital controls, literally stopping money from leaving the country.
Okay, so let's zoom out one last time. As chaotic and frankly as unprecedented as all these events seemed, when you place them in a broader historical context, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge.
This quote from our source material really gets to the heart of it. A massive debt bubble, followed by a crash, interest rates hitting zero, the invention of new forms of money printing, and then a subsequent rise in social conflict and populism. This isn't the first time this sequence has happened. It closely mirrors the template of the 1930s.
And that leaves us with a final, crucial question. If we've just lived through a chapter of history that rhymes with the 1930s, what can that well-worn template tell us about the chapter we're entering now? It suggests that the forces that were unleashed back in 2008 are far from over, and understanding this cycle is the key to understanding the world we live in today.
Let's be real. The economy since 2020 has felt like a wild roller coaster, right? It's like all the old rules just got thrown out the window. You've probably felt it. So what actually happened? In this explainer, we're going to unpack the long-term debt cycle to really get a grip on the powerful forces that have completely reshaped our financial world.
This quote right here, it's really the key to everything we're talking about. It's this idea that the economic rules we all think are permanent, well, they're not. Sooner or later, reality comes knocking, and a big enough crisis can make those rules bend and sometimes break completely.
And in 2020, that's exactly what happened. The biggest test in a generation arrived with a global pandemic that brought the entire world economy to a screeching halt. So what happens when the old playbook is suddenly totally useless?
So the pandemic wasn't just some small bump in the road. It triggered a crisis so huge that it didn't just bend the rules, it completely shattered them. Governments and central banks had to basically write a whole new playbook, on the fly, in real time.
I mean, just stop and think about it for a second. Entire industries, travel, restaurants, shopping, they all just shut down, almost overnight. This wasn't your typical recession. You can't just, tweak interest rates a little bit and fix that. The response had to be something totally different, something direct and something absolutely massive.
And that brand new strategy is what the source material for this explainer calls Monetary Policy 3, or just MP3. And trust me, It's a huge departure from anything we've seen before, and it is the key to understanding the economy we're all living in right now.
So what on earth is MMP3? Okay, here's the simplest way to think about it. It's a direct partnership. The government spends trillions of dollars it doesn't have on things like stimulus checks. And at the same time, the central bank literally prints new money to buy up all that new government debt. This whole coordinated move is designed to get money directly into the hands of people and businesses, bypassing the old financial system.
And this slide, this really lays out just how different this MP3 thing is. Before, the central bank had two main tools in its toolbox. First, monetary policy 1, that's just lowering interest rates. When that stopped working, we got monetary policy 2, or quantitative easing. That's when the central bank buys up financial assets. But here's the thing, both of those mostly help people who already owned assets. You know, Wall Street. MP3 is a different beast entirely. It's a team-up, a coordinated push to get cash directly on a main street.
Whoa, and this chart it says it all, doesn't it? Just look at that red line, the U.S. monetary base. See that insane spike after 2020? I mean, it's a vertical wall. That is MP3 in action. A tidal wave of new money flooding the system on a scale we have literally never seen before. So what happens when you flood the system with basically free money? Well, you get what the source calls an orgy of borrowing. It kicked off these wild speculative bubbles in everything from tech stocks to crypto. It felt a lot like the dot-com boom all over again, which just goes to show, when money is that cheap, you get a frenzy. But, you know, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? You can't just inject that much money into the economy and not have consequences. And what came next was the inevitable economic hangover. And boy, did it arrive with a vengeance. Okay, first up, look at this blue line. This is government debt as a chunk of the whole economy, and it just skyrocketed. All that emergency spending had to be paid for with borrowed money, pushing public debt to levels we haven't seen in generations.
And right on cue, inflation. You have trillions of new dollars chasing the same amount of stuff, and prices have nowhere to go but up. That red line there, that's the Consumer Price Index, and that spike, that was the biggest jump in the cost of living in over 40 years. So what do you do when inflation is out of control? Well, the central bank had to do a complete 180. To try and tame that runaway inflation, they had no choice but to slam on the economic brakes and hard by jacking up interest rates faster than they had in decades. And the effect was almost immediate. Now, this chart of the yield curve might look a little technical, but the takeaway is simple. When it goes negative, or inverts, it's basically the economy's check engine light coming on. It's a classic warning sign that things are cooling down fast, and a recession could be just around the corner. And that economic pain, it ripped right through the financial markets. All those speculative bubbles that got so big when money was free, they started to pop. As the source points out, the value of stocks and bonds took its biggest nosedive since the 2009 financial crisis. Yeah, the party was officially over.
But here's the thing about these huge economic waves. They don't lift all boats equally. In fact, what this period did was expose, and in many cases dramatically widen, some of the biggest divides in our society.
And these charts, wow, they are just so stark. We're showing them side by side because they tell the same powerful story for both wealth and income. That blue line, for Americans with a college degree, just keeps climbing. But the red line, for those without, is headed in the opposite direction. And the thing is, this was already happening, but the recent economic turmoil, it was like pouring gasoline on the fire.
Now, the source material we're looking at makes a really interesting connection here. It argues that these economic pressures, especially the stress of inflation and that growing wealth gap, actually fueled more political polarization. When people feel like they're losing ground financially, it often makes internal conflicts even worse.
So, how do we make sense of all this? It can feel kind of overwhelming, right? Well, the source argues we've got to zoom out, because this crazy cycle of debt and inflation isn't happening in a vacuum. It's actually interacting with 4 other huge forces that are all shaping our future at the exact same time.
Okay, so the source lays out what it calls the 5 big forces. First is the massive debt cycle we've been talking about. Second is the internal conflict over wealth and values. Third, you've got external conflicts between major world powers. Fourth, acts of nature, things like pandemics or climate change. And fifth, game-changing technology, like AI. And the key takeaway is that all 5 of these are hitting us at once. And when you put all of that together, the debt, the internal divisions, the rising tensions between countries,
The source makes this absolutely stunning comparison. It says that our current moment looks, and I quote, quite like the 1930s period.
And that leaves all of us with a really big question. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So if we are living through a familiar part of a much bigger cycle, what are the lessons we absolutely have to learn from the past to help us navigate whatever comes next?
They say empires, just like people, have a kind of life cycle. There's a rise, a peak, and then a decline. Today, we're going to use that exact idea, the big cycle, to look at one of the most incredible stories of our lifetime, modern China. It's the best way to really get our heads around its amazing past and its really tricky future.
And that brings us to this massive question, right? I mean, how did China pull off the single greatest reduction of poverty in all of human history? It's just staggering. So why, after all that mind-blowing success, is its economic engine suddenly sputtering? And more importantly, how did that success actually lead to the very crisis it's staring down today? Honestly, these two charts right here, they pretty much tell the whole story. On the left, you've got a measure of national power. We're talking economics, military, tech, the whole 9 yards. And you can see China just shooting up like a rocket, closing in on the US. And then, look at the chart on the right. It's a gauge of conflict, and it almost perfectly mirrors that rise. This is the big cycle playing out in real time. When a new power rises to challenge the old one, things get tense. Let's dig into how we got here.
So where did this meteoric rise even begin? To really understand where China is today, you have to go back to the moment everything changed, the moment they lit the fuse on their economic rocket ship. You can basically break down modern China's story into 3 big acts, each one defined by its leader. First, you have the revolutionary period under Mao Zedong. Then came the game-changing era of reform under Deng Xiaoping. And that brings us to today, the era of consolidation and, well, renewed strength under Xi Jinping.
So, after 1949, under Mao, China pretty much closed itself off from the world. It was a country still healing from decades of war, and it was run by a really rigid ideology. The main goal wasn't creating wealth. It was all about ideological purity. And because of that, its economy just kind of stalled out while a lot of the world was booming.
And then everything changed. Deng Xiaoping came to power, and he had this totally new, super pragmatic philosophy. It's all summed up in this famous quote. All of a sudden, it wasn't about the color of the cat, the ideology. It was about whether it could catch mice. Results were all that mattered. He famously said, "To get rich is glorious," and boom, he threw open China's doors to the global economy.
So what did that incredible pivot actually do? Well, this. Just look at this number. Since 1984, China's income per person has skyrocketed by 20 times. I mean, stop and think about that for a second. A 20-fold increase in wealth in just one generation. It is, without a doubt, the most stunning economic miracle in history. But here's the thing. That kind of explosive growth was fueled by something that would, eventually, create a massive problem. Underneath the surface of this economic miracle, a huge challenge was brewing, and it all revolved around one word: debt.
Now, debt is not a new thing for China at all. If you look back through its history, as this chart shows, you see this pattern again and again. These huge debt buildups happen. They often end with some kind of wipeout or a big conflict, and then a new system emerges. It's a core part of its big cycle. And the most important thing to realize is we are deep into another one of those massive buildups right now.
And here's what today's buildup looks like. After the 2008 financial crisis, when the whole world was struggling, China just turned on the credit tabs to keep its economy roaring. Just look at how that corporate and household debt went completely vertical. It's wild. Today, the private sector owes more than double the country's entire economic output. That is just a staggering mountain of debt.
You just can't keep that kind of credit party going forever, right? A lot of that money went into building apartments and infrastructure that, frankly, nobody needed. So in 2021, that massive bubble finally started to burst. And that kicked off this really painful process called deleveraging, which is just a fancy way of saying everyone is trying to pay back their debts at the same time. And when that happens, spending grinds to a halt, construction stops, and the whole economy hits the brakes hard.
Okay, so while China was wrestling with these huge problems at home, its relationship with the rest of the world was getting more and more tense. The rising power wasn't just rising anymore, it was now a competing power. And you can't find a clearer example of that tension than Taiwan. From Beijing's point of view, it's simple. Taiwan is a part of China. End of story. And any U.S. involvement is just meddling. But from Washington's perspective, China is a major challenge to the entire global system, and Taiwan is a critical flashpoint in that fight. It's like two people looking at the exact same thing but seeing two completely different realities.
And this friction goes way beyond just Taiwan. You've got China's huge claims in the South China Sea, constant allegations of intellectual property theft, its big plan to dominate future technologies, and of course, the punishing trade war that really kicked off around 2018. All of these things are really just symptoms of this much bigger great power rivalry. And that brings us right up to this very moment. President Xi Jinping himself has talked about a 100-year storm, a convergence of dangers that China hasn't seen in a century. This isn't some future prediction. This is the reality they're dealing with right now.
So this storm isn't just one thing. It's actually 5 huge forces all crashing together at the same time. You've got the crippling debt crisis, you've got tightening political control at home, you have the growing conflict with the US, you have the shock of the pandemic, and on top of all that, there's this fierce war over the technologies that will shape the future, like AI and chips. I mean, any one of these would be a massive challenge for a country. All of them together, it's an unprecedented test.
So how does the leadership respond to a storm like that? Well, we've seen a major shift. The era of the economic reformers, the guys who opened China up, that's over. Now the emphasis is on loyalty, patriotism, and much tighter state control. It seems like the strategy is to weather the storm by turning inward and relying on traditional communist principles, not open markets. And that leaves China standing at this historic crossroads, getting squeezed by a debt crisis from within and intense conflict from without. This is the ultimate stress test for its entire system. So, will all these forces cause a crisis that knocks it off course, or will it somehow manage to consolidate its power and come out of this storm even stronger? The answer to that question is going to define not just China's future, but all of ours.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into Japan's incredible, decades-long fight against a literal mountain of debt. And trust me, this isn't just a story about Japan. It's a huge warning sign for, well, pretty much everyone else.
So let's kick things off with a real head-scratcher. Did you know that not too long ago, the average person in Japan was actually richer than the average American? Yeah, in US dollar terms. But today, they're about 60% poor. How on earth does a reversal that big even happen? Well, we're about to find out.
Okay, so to understand this, we've got to go back in time. Picture this. It's 1990. Japan is riding high at the absolute peak of this massive economic bubble. I mean, we're talking one of the biggest the world had ever seen. And the whole thing, it was built on a foundation of debt.
And this chart, wow, this really puts it into perspective.
This is what a big debt cycle looks like in the wild. See that gigantic mountain of debt climbing up to 1990? That's the bubble inflating. The entire country was borrowing money like there was no tomorrow. But you know the saying, right? What goes up must come down. And boy, did it come down hard. What followed was a bust of epic proportions. So the bubble bursts. And what happens next wasn't just a simple recession. Nope. Japan fell into this period of economic quicksand, a stagnation so long and so deep it earned the name the Lost Decades. And for over 20 years, Japan's response was basically a textbook example of what you should never do. Instead of tackling the problem head-on, restructuring all that debt and trying to jumpstart the economy, the policymakers just hesitated. And that hesitation was fatal. It created this vacuum that deflation just rushed into. That's when prices and wages start falling, and the whole economy just grinds to a painful halt. What you ended up with was an economy completely clogged up with what people started calling zombie institutions. Think about that. These are banks and companies that were basically dead, but they were kept on life support by bailouts. The problem is they were so weighed down by all their old debt that they couldn't invest, they couldn't innovate, they couldn't grow. They were just there, blocking any chance of a real recovery for years and years.
Okay, fast forward to 2013. We're talking 2 decades of economic pain later. It was painfully obvious that the old way just wasn't working. So Japan decided to do something completely different. It was time for a radical, and I mean radical, economic experiment.
This new plan got the nickname Abenomics, and it was basically a 3-part shock and awe campaign. Arrow number 1, the central bank would start printing money, and lots of it. Arrow 2, the government would go on a massive spending spree. And Arrow 3, they'd push through a bunch of reforms to try and make the economy more competitive. The whole goal, to finally break that vicious cycle of deflation. And you know what? This wild plan actually started to get the economy moving again. But, and this is a big but, it came at a serious price. It created a really clear division. There were definite winners and there were definite losers.
Now this is where things get really fascinating. Just look at this slide. On the left, you see Japan's total government debt continuing to climb and climb. But then you look at the chart on the right, and the government's payments on that debt are plummeting. Wait, what? How does your debt go up while your payments go down? That shouldn't be possible, right? Well, the answer is a controversial little policy called debt monetization. Here's what that means in plain English. The Bank of Japan literally started printing yen and used that new money to buy its own government's debt. And we're not talking a little bit. They bought a staggering amount, eventually owning more than half of all of it. Just think about that. When you have a giant guaranteed buyer for something, in this case the central bank buying bonds, the price of those bonds gets pushed way up. And here's the key. When bond prices go up, the interest rate or yield on them goes down. They basically forced interest rates down to almost nothing.
So here's the punchline. The government basically solved its own debt problem. With interest payments near zero, that massive pile of debt suddenly became totally manageable. But this wasn't some kind of magic trick. There's no free lunch in economics. Someone, somewhere had to foot the bill. And this slide right here, this shows you exactly who paid that price. The ones who got hit the hardest? Everyday Japanese savers. Anyone holding government bonds. I mean, just take a second and look at these numbers. Since 2013, if you held Japanese bonds, you lost 45% of your money compared to if you just held US bonds. And compared to gold, a whopping 60% loss. Your savings were just annihilated. And the impact on the average person's wealth, especially when you look at it globally, was absolutely devastating. This chart is just stunning. Back in the good old bubble days, the average income in Japan was actually higher than in the US. Now, it's about 60% lower. Any Japanese person who travels or buys things from overseas feels this in their wallet every single day. So, what was the secret sauce here? What was the hidden mechanism that allowed all this to happen? Let's peel back the last layer and look at the real price of this so-called fix. The entire plan hinged on one thing: engineering a massive devaluation of Japan's currency, the yen. And as you can see right here, they succeeded. Since this whole thing kicked off in 2013, the yen has lost over 40% of its value against the US dollar. That's a huge drop. Now, this weaker yen was fantastic, if you were the government. It made Japanese cars and electronics way cheaper for the rest of the world, boosting exports, and it also magically shrank the size of their debt when you measure it in dollars. But for regular people, it was a disaster. It was like a hidden tax that just vaporized the international value of their savings. And suddenly, anything imported, from the gas for your car to a new smartphone, got way, way more expensive. And that brings us full circle, right back to the question we started with. That unbelievable 60% drop in wealth compared to Americans, that wasn't some random accident. It was the direct, calculated, and frankly inevitable result of the specific path Japan chose to solve its government's debt crisis. So if there's one crystal clear lesson to take away from this whole story, it's this. When you see a country with a ton of debt start printing money to pay its bills, do not own that country's government bonds. It is just not a winning strategy. Which leads us to the incredibly dangerous tightrope Japan is walking right now. This entire fix only works as long as interest rates stay at or near zero. I mean, forever. Look at this chart. If rates were to go up by just 3%, which, by the way, is a totally normal level historically, the government's interest payments would absolutely explode. It would create a massive new deficit and could kick off a brand new and maybe uncontrollable debt spiral. So, let's wrap this up. Japan pulled off a pretty incredible escape from its debt trap. They did it by devaluing their currency. And let's be honest, by transferring a huge amount of wealth from private savers to the government. But in solving one massive problem, they've created a totally new one, a new kind of fragility, and it leaves us all with one massive unanswered question for the future.
You know, there's this really strange thing happening with the US economy right now. On the surface, things seem kind of stable, right? But if you start to dig just a little bit deeper, you find some really serious warning signs for the future. So what is the real story here? Let's get into it.
It's really the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? How on earth do you spot a financial crisis before it actually happens? It's not about having a crystal ball, not at all. It's about having the right framework to actually read the signs.
Think of it like a doctor giving a checkup, but for an entire country. You wouldn't just take a temperature and call it a day, right? No, you'd check blood pressure, heart rate, you'd run the whole panel of tests. Well, for an economy, that means looking at debt, reserves, and a bunch of other vital signs all at once. And when we apply this dashboard to the US, the results are pretty surprising.
So, what does this dashboard actually tell us about the United States? It reveals a story that's, well, both reassuring and, at the same time, deeply, deeply concerning. It's really a tale of two polar opposite risks.
Okay, just take a look at this. On the left, you've got the long-term risk gauge for the US government cranked all the way to 100%. I mean, it is completely maxed out. But then, on the right, the short-term risk is at zero. Zilch. Nothing. How can both of these things possibly be true at the exact same time?
And make no mistake, the author of this analysis is not pulling any punches when it comes to that long-term risk. I mean, this quote is a pretty chilling assessment. That phrase, point of no return, that suggests a future where this whole debt problem stops being something we can manage and just becomes this unstoppable force all on its own. To really get our heads around this, the source gives us a brilliant analogy. High long-term risk is like your doctor telling you, hey, with your diet and lifestyle, you're at a very high chance of having a heart attack someday. But high short-term risk, that means you're on the gurney, having a heart attack right now. The U.S. is firmly in that first category. The risk factors are dangerously high, but for now, the patient is still walking around. Okay, so let's break this down. Why is that long-term risk gauge maxed out at 100%? The first and by far the biggest piece of this puzzle is just the staggering mountain of government debt. This is the absolute nightmare scenario for any economy, the debt-death spiral. It's a vicious cycle where a country has so much debt that it has to borrow new money just to pay the interest on its old debts. And of course, that new borrowing just makes the total debt bigger, which means the next interest payments are even bigger, and you see how the whole thing just spirals out of control. This is that point of no return. So how do we actually measure this kind of risk? The source uses a statistical tool called a z-score. Now, don't worry, you don't need a math degree for this. All you have to remember is one magic number. Anything above 2.0 is considered quite bad. That's the danger zone. And here it is. The current reading for the U.S. government's long-term risk is 2.4. So we're already well into that danger zone. This isn't some borderline case. It's a very clear signal that the amount of money the government has to borrow is creating a really significant vulnerability. But wait, it doesn't stop there. When the analysis looks 10 years into the future, that score jumps all the way up to 2.8. What this is telling us is that the problem isn't just sitting still. It's actually getting worse. The trend is absolutely heading in the wrong direction. Now, the government isn't the only player in this game. The U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, is a huge part of this story, and it is facing its own very delicate balancing act. So let's look at the Fed's dashboard. Just like the government, short-term risk is at 0, but the long-term risk is at 46%. Now that's historically high, even if it's not the crazy 100% we saw for the government. So what's driving this number? This risk is really being driven by a few key things. First off, the Fed owns a massive chunk of that government debt we were just talking about, which kind of ties its fate directly to the government's. Second, as it raised interest rates to fight inflation, the value of all those bonds it holds, well, it tanked, causing the Fed to take the biggest financial losses in its entire history. And finally, its own net worth is in pretty bad shape. You put all those together and they push that risk gauge up to 46%. So, with all this risk piling up, you have to be asking, why isn't the whole system collapsing? Well, the answer is the US's ultimate trump card. The dollar is the king of the world. As you can see, the dollar dominates everything: world reserves, debt, and trade. For decades, everything important, especially commodities like oil, has been priced in dollars. And right now, there just isn't another good alternative on that scale. This creates this massive, built-in demand for US dollars and US debt, and it acts as a giant safety net. For now. This brings us to the really crucial question. If the situation is stable for the moment, what should we be watching for? What are the specific triggers that could turn this long-term risk into a very real short-term crisis?
And the source is super specific here. It doesn't just give us a vague list of things to worry about. It points to two key events that it calls big red flags. If you see these happening, it's a huge sign that things are about to get very real.
And here they are. First, another big round of quantitative easing. That's the fancy term for when the central bank basically prints money to buy up government debt. And second, any move by the government to take political control over the Federal Reserve and strip away its independence. If either of these things happens, it is a major sign that a crisis could be starting. So, this is really the paradox in a nutshell. On the surface, the whole system feels stable. The dollar is strong, the economy is chugging along, but underneath all that, the source describes the government's debt problem as a growing cancer, an imbalance that just gets worse every single day, silently threatening the entire structure. And that leaves us with the final question, doesn't it? We have stability today, but it's a stability that depends entirely on the world's continued faith in the US dollar, propping up a debt load that is, by these metrics, unsustainable. The numbers suggest the foundation is cracking. The only question is, how much time is left before it all gives way? You hear about the US national debt all the time, right? It feels like this giant, tangled mess. But what if the solution was actually surprisingly simple? Today, we're going to break down a really bold idea that says you can fix it all by just remembering one single number. So let's get into it. Okay, so before we can even talk about the solution, we've got to get our heads around just how big this problem is. I mean, we all hear the debt numbers on the news, but they're so huge, they're almost meaningless, right? The real story, the scary part, is when you look at the trend. So check this out. That red line, that's where we've been, our debt compared to how much money the government brings in. But the thing that should really make you sit up and pay attention is that dashed blue line. That's where the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projects we're headed. And it's not just going up, it's accelerating. It's on a path that, well, just isn't sustainable. When you see a chart like that, it kind of begs the question, doesn't it? Is there any way to steer this ship in a different direction before we hit an iceberg? The proposal we're looking at today says absolutely yes, and it suggests a way to do it that might just bypass all the usual political fighting. All right, so let's jump into the solution. It's a framework built on 3 parts, and the whole point is that it's supposed to be simple, easy to remember, and something that could actually be done.
The whole plan, everything we're about to talk about, comes back to one single number. That's it. Just remember the number 3. It's kind of like the magic key to the whole thing.
So here's the plan in a nutshell. First goal, take the annual budget deficit. That's the shortfall each year, and chop it in half. We're talking about going from a projected 6% of the country's GDP all the way down to a much more stable 3%. And the second goal, you guessed it, use 3 specific tools, or levers, to make that happen. So what would that actually do? What's the payoff? Well, according to the analysis, if you follow this plan, in 20 years, the national debt would be, get this, $26 trillion lower than where it's currently headed. That's not just a small tweak. That's a massive change of direction. Okay, so what are these 3 levers of power? Let's unpack the toolkit that this whole plan relies on. The tools themselves are pretty straightforward, things you've heard of before. You've got spending cuts, tax increases, and having the Federal Reserve cut interest rates. Each one of these is meant to help close that deficit gap. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. These 3 levers, they are not created equal, not even close. If you wanted to hit that 3% deficit target using only one of them, you'd have to cut government spending by a whopping 12% or raise taxes by 11%. But now look at interest rates. All you'd need is a 3% cut to get the same results. The takeaway here is huge. Interest rates are, by a long shot, the most powerful tool they have. And that leads to what might be the most counterintuitive part of this whole analysis. You know how we're always focused on what Congress is doing with spending and taxes? Well, ironically, it's actually the Federal Reserve, the institution that controls interest rates, that holds the most powerful key to the whole debt problem. So you might be thinking, well, if interest rates are so powerful, why not just use that one lever and call it a day? The thing is, this proposal argues for a more balanced approach, not just pulling one lever as hard as you can. The ideal strategy here is to combine two things. You have what's called fiscal tightening, that's the spending cuts and tax hikes, which can kind of put the brakes on the economy. And you pair that with monetary easing, that's the interest rate cuts, which do the opposite, they stimulate the economy. The goal is to find that perfect sweet spot, right? Fix the debt, but without tipping the country into a recession. So this brings us to the actual recipe, the proposed mix. We're talking about a roughly 4% cut in spending, a 4% increase in taxes, and just a 1% cut in interest rates. See how that works? By spreading the load across all three, no single area gets hit too hard. Yeah, but let's be real, cutting spending is always the trickiest part politically. And this chart really shows you why. Over 60% of the entire federal budget is what's called mandatory spending. We're talking about programs like Social Security and Medicare, things that are incredibly popular and, well, politically dangerous to touch. To make all this easier to swallow, the idea is to not do it all at once. Instead, you'd phase these changes in over 3 years. That gradual approach, which you can see in that smoother blue line, means you avoid shocking the system. You give the economy time to adjust. Okay, so if the plan is this clear, why haven't we done it? That's the big question, right? Well, the analysis looks back at history, not just to figure out why, but to make a pretty strong case for why right now is actually the perfect time to get this done. When you look at historical examples of countries that have successfully slashed their deficits, a really clear pattern emerges. The cuts tend to work out well and are even kind of painless when 3 conditions are met. And the US definitely checks that third box, since our debts are in our own currency.
And the argument goes like this. Because the US economy is pretty strong right now, it's the ideal moment to make these kinds of cuts. It's what economists call a counter-cyclical move. Basically, you fix the roof while the sun is shining instead of waiting for a hurricane when it's much more painful and difficult. And this isn't just some abstract theory either. We have a real-world example right here in the US back in the 1990s. In just 5 years, the country went from having a pretty big deficit to actually having a budget surplus. That was a huge turnaround, a 5% swing in GDP, and it happened while the economy was booming.
This quote really nails this central idea. The time to fix your debt problems isn't when you're in a panic. It's a strategic move you're supposed to make when your economy is strong and you're in a position of power.
So this all brings us to a final, really powerful thought. The analysis suggests that a clear, workable, data-driven plan is sitting right there. It reframes the whole issue. It's not so much an economic puzzle as it is a question of political will. And that leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? If a solution is actually within our grasp, what's stopping our leaders from taking it?
What if you could actually understand the future? Not by some magical prediction, but by recognizing these huge historical patterns that just repeat themselves over and over again. Well, today, we're diving into a really powerful framework that's designed to do exactly that.
We've all heard it, right? Trying to predict the future is a total fool's game. The investor Ray Dalio has a much sharper way of putting it. It's a powerful reminder of just how messy and uncertain things can get when you're just guessing.
But here's the big idea we're digging into. What if all the major shifts happening in the world, what if they aren't just random chaos? What if they're actually driven by these timeless cause and effect relationships that we've seen again and again throughout history?
Okay, so if a crystal ball is out, what's the alternative? Well, that's where this whole idea of a model comes in, a kind of template built on history to help us understand the massive forces that are shaping what's just around the corner.
Now, let's be clear, this isn't about forecasting exactly what's going to happen on a specific day. Not at all. It's about spotting these huge, unsustainable situations and understanding the cycles that control them. Think of it like having a leg up, because you actually know the rules of the game we're all playing.
So, at the very heart of this framework is a concept Dalio calls the big cycle.
The big cycle is basically the lifespan of an entire world order. You know, it's born, it grows up, it gets strong, and then eventually it declines and something new takes its place. And this whole process, it isn't random. It moves through these distinct, identifiable stages.
So, the big question is, where are we right now in this huge cycle? According to this model, the answer is, well, it's very specific, and to be honest, it's pretty alarming. We're in stage 5. This is a late and, historically speaking, a very, very turbulent part of the cycle.
So what does being in stage 5 actually mean for us? Well, if you look at the historical template, this is the point where the existing world order is showing some serious signs of stress. It's on the verge of breaking down to make way for whatever comes next.
And this slide right here shows you exactly why this is such a critical moment. The model points out that our current conditions, tons of debt, deep political divides, and challenges from rising global powers, are eerily similar to the 1930s. And we all know what happened next back then, a monumental shift in the global order.
So what's driving all this? The model says there are 5 major forces at play. Let's start with the first 3, because these are the massive headwinds that are pushing us towards conflict.
First up, we've got the debt force. I mean, just look at this chart. The amount of debt in the world's biggest economies has just skyrocketed. We're talking about unsustainable levels that create this enormous financial fragility.
The second force is all the conflict happening inside countries. This chart shows something pretty startling. Political polarization around the world is now the worst it has been in over 100 years. When you're this divided, it makes compromise and just governing effectively incredibly difficult.
And third, when things are a mess at home, it doesn't take long for that to spill over into conflicts between countries. This chart tracks the rising tension between the US and China, which is a classic great power struggle that you always see in this late stage of the cycle.
But it's not all doom and gloom. There are 2 other massive forces at play here, and they're acting like powerful wildcards that are reshaping our world as we speak.
And those 2 wildcards are force number 4, which is the power of nature, and force number 5, the incredible power of human ingenuity, or technology.
So the fourth force is nature itself. The rising costs from climate events, from pandemics, it all adds another huge layer of stress on governments that are already drowning in debt and completely fractured politically.
And then you have the fifth force, this powerful tailwind that's pushing back against all the bad stuff. Technology. Seriously, just look at this chart. It shows the incredible, accelerating pace of human progress, all driven by our own inventiveness. This is the great counterforce to all the problems we've been talking about.
So, where does that leave us? You've got these immense negative forces of debt and conflict crashing head-on into the incredible positive force of technology. Which one is going to win?
This is really the central question of our time, isn't it? Can our own creativity and productivity outrun the enormous financial and political problems we've created for ourselves?
This slide just puts it all together visually. On one side, you have the rising forces of conflict. On the other, the rising forces of human progress. The big question is, which one of those lines is going to be more powerful in the years ahead?
Well, the model's conclusion, based on studying all these similar moments in history, is pretty sobering. As powerful as our technology is, it probably won't be enough to overcome the combined weight of all those negative forces, at least not in the near term. Historically, when things get this messy, the gains from new tech tend to get squelched by everything else.
So, what do you do with all this information? Well, it all comes down to this really interesting, kind of paradoxical quote. If you're not worried, you need to worry, and if you're worried, you don't need to worry. What on earth does that mean?
It basically means this. If you're not worried, you're just not paying attention to these huge forces, and that leaves you totally exposed. But if you are worried, it means you see what's happening. And that's actually a good thing, because that worry is what motivates you to understand what's going on, to build up your own resilience, and to prepare for the profound changes that this historical cycle suggests are already well underway.